Today we go down the rabbit hole with Richard Joseph. Richard is a polymath focused currently on mental health. As you'll hear, we get very deep very quickly on a number of seemingly disparate topics, including his work in the ad industry when he worked at Google, the issues with the public sector, how he views determinism versus free will, how the mental health industry is broken, issues with the DSM-5, his distaste for the royal family, and so much more. Though this sounds like a rambling set of topics, it is anything but. These are very interconnected topics. We'll likely have to have Richard back at some point because we simply just ran out of time. With that, please buckle up for this roller coaster with Richard Joseph. Welcome to the Arsenic Show. Today, I have Richard Joseph. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very good, thank you.
Yes, thanks for coming. We were definitely wrestling with the mics and audio and all kinds of stuff coming onto the show today. So thank you for bearing with me. That was more of an ordeal than it is we normally have to do. We installed some new stuff, and just every time we touch anything, it's just like a house of cards. It all just falls over, and we got to redo stuff. So thank you for being patient with us.
Well, they're the laws, you know. What can happen will happen.
What a mess. So you flew in from London, is that right?
From London today, yeah.
Yeah.
So, especially to come and hang out with you.
How do you feel?
I feel great. I feel good. So
yeah.
I've got some whiskey in my system now. So
give it an hour. You're just like.
I got some sleep on the flight.
Oh, did you?
That was good.
Oh,
yeah.
good.
And then I came, and rather than get some food, I got some whiskey, and that will keep me going.
For at least for an hour.
Yeah.
So we originally met through one of my other guests, actually, Kurt Simon Harlinghausen. How did you meet him, out of curiosity?
So I met Simon when I was working at Publicis. Publicis actually bought his company, and then sort of one of these weird hierarchy type sort of things. Like we ended up sort of working like alongside each other for a little while, even though they just spent an inordinate amount of money, I would imagine. I'm sure he'd say they got value for money on buying his company. So yeah, we worked together there. I had kind of joined Publicis from Google. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that. I mean, so how'd you find your way to Google? Like that is not super common for people to work there. So
no, so sort of around the houses, to be honest. I kind of did the sort of advertising thing, sort of started off when I was pretty young, doing kind of working in agencies, like, and doing that sort of classic media buying, media planning, that sort of stuff. And then somehow found my way into Google.
How did that happen?
It was just, I just kind of decided that I wanted to work there, to be honest. It was just that there's no real like.
Most people don't get to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm like a white heterosexual, like middle class man, you know. Yeah. So it's kind of, things are.
So you were the diversity hire, is what you're saying?
Yeah. I just think that kind of like this thing of you when you're in a certain age. I lived in central London, you know, and it's just like I had, you know, a certain level of education, experience and stuff. And at that point, I do think it becomes about kind of, can you will yourself into it? You know, how much do you want it? Like, how much are you prepared to do it? So I just decided that I wanted to work there and sort of found a way of making that happen. So
you just waited out on the doorstep for the hiring manager kind of thing?
Pretty much something like that, you know. Like I went through my 13 or so interviews and they seemed to go sort of quite well. But it's just, I think that when it gets to that point, it's just a case of can you figure it out, you know? So like there's a problem there to be solved, and that problem is ultimately like, can you say the right things, you know? Like, or can you understand what they're looking for?
I always say that Texas needs people to be a thing, and if they are not willing to be that thing, Texas will chew them up and spit them out. I have a feeling that interview process is quite similar. It just needs you to be a thing. And if you're able to be that thing, then you're in. If you're not able to be that thing, like I have some buddies who went through the process and they asked them questions and they're like, that's a stupid fucking question. Like that's not how to think about the problem at all. Spit them out.
So, yeah, I mean, it depends on, we could really tumble down this rabbit hole for quite a long time. You know, I mean, we could sort of bring up Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent here and sort of like really sort of start talking about, you know, what is that system? You know, what are they selecting for? And then you could just look at it from, you know, a Myers-Briggs sort of perspective, and you could just go, can you work out a Myers-Briggs? Yes, you can. You know, it's just 40 questions. It's just and once you understand the framework that they're being asked in, which doesn't take that long to learn, you can pretty much answer it however you want it to be answered. So you can come out on any one of those quadrants that you want. So that's all it is. It's really looking at, like, what do they want you to say at that point? You know, what are they hiring for? And if you do enough research, you know, you understand that, then there's enough. I mean, there's entire websites now about, like, how to get a job at Google sort of thing. So it really depends on.
Did you use them out of curiosity?
Yeah, like I definitely use them. Yeah, in the same way that kind of you think of like ChatGPT and things now. It's kind of how good are your prompts, right? And some people really understand big data, and they understand the complexities of big data and actually like what they're searching. So they can get really, really specific on their prompts. And some people don't understand it. So they still think of it in really generic terms. So they're just not getting us specific information just because they're not typing in the right prompt. So it's the same thing, right? It's like I kind of, from a people sort of perspective, you either understand, you know, how to tell somebody what they want to hear, or you don't. I think that's what it comes down to in the corporate world, right?
Yeah, but it seems like they're really trying to hire for a certain kind of person. So do you have a sense of what that kind of person is?
Yeah, so they literally have a set sort of way of doing it. So there's these 4 interviews in a day that you have. So there's 4, I think they're either 30 minutes or 45 minutes, going back a little bit sort of, and they're back to back. And each of those people are measuring you on just one specific thing. And those 4 people are supposed to be people that don't know each other in the company, and also aren't going to be the people that hire you. So the idea is that you go through this sort of vetting process. So
they have nothing to do with your actual position. They're just kind of random places in the company. Absolutely,
yeah. They're just random people, and there's a whole interview process that sort of you go through in terms of to be a Google interviewer. Now I'm going to try and remember what the 4 areas are, but I'm going to get this wrong. But you can just look it up online, and it will. Sure. But I think it's something like. It's one of them is definitely called googliness, and that's kind of like your personality fit. You know, like do you fit with the Google vibe? Then
how would you define the Google vibe?
So they have set characteristics as far as I'm aware that sort of you get scored up or down on. I think it's things like arrogance. They don't like not being a team player. They don't like. And there's certain things like humble, being a team player, etc., that you get scored like very highly on. Like I'm sort of slightly, I mean, I'm paraphrasing and sort of going into the back of my memory to sort of pull this out. So, but you can easily find this. But I think it's something like each one of those 4 people give you a mark out of 25, and you need an overall score out of that 100. In order to get through to the next round. And that's then the hiring man, the person whose team you'll be in. So it's kind of a bit of, these people have all been vetted. They've got through this point, and now it's up to you to kind of make a decision. And I think by the time such limited amounts of people get through that by the time it actually gets to the person that's hiring, they sort of just go, well, yes, you know, and their questions are more around the, do I want to go for a beer with this type of person? Because they've already done all of the competency stuff. So I think the 4 areas are googliness, lateral and logical thinking. And then I think the 4th one is maybe experience within the role, like sort of competency. But the logical and lateral ones are very basic. You know, it's kind of, they used to do these whole ones in the past, you know, of this, how many golf balls can you fit on an aeroplane? That sort of stuff. And what they were really looking at there is like how you're working that out. So, you know,
you mean literally on top of the airplane as it's flying, or?
But that's the same thing, right? And then it's like how much are you prepared to question that? You know, how much are you actually prepared to get to the answer of it? And you'll get to a point of you're saying, well, what type of aeroplane is it? What size is the aeroplane? You know, I'm assuming that they're standard size golf balls because I can't think of any other different size golf balls. But but all of these things are
it could be novelty.
Exactly. And then these things are how well are you questioning it? And I guess depending on whether it's lateral or logical, you know, that you're being marked on at that point, or you're being judged on, more accurately sort of put. at that point. They would sort of take all of this into account, and then sometimes they would just stop and sort of say, okay, well, I'm not going to tell you that, but you decide for yourself. But they decided not to do that, so now the questions are much more kind of rational. It's kind of I'm trying to think of the ones that I had. It was they wrote a list of clients on a whiteboard, and then it was like, this is how much this client is worth to the company, but this is how much they're spending overall, you know, like in terms of marketing budgets or advertising budgets, and how would you split your time across these 10 clients, you know, based on that. So it's very basic in terms of that you're looking at it of what percentage is Google getting of their overall advertising, where is the opportunity cost, and how would you divide your week up across these sort of 10 clients. So it's the most basic form of it, but I guess in that sense they're obviously scoring you on that sort of one side of it. So
And so what would you say the kind of the average Googler was like to work with?
So the way it was told to me, and sort of my experience of working there, is that every position is overhired for. And I certainly wouldn't be the expert on this matter. You know, there's people that have worked in Google for way longer than sort of I did that would be the expert. I can just kind of give you my sort of take on it, which was that they overhire for every position. And the reason they overhire for every position is, you've probably heard that thing of like, the Enron thing, like the smartest guy in the room type vibe. And kind of when you're speaking to someone from Google, people would always have this impression that that person's really smart. But what it normally means is that person is just, they did that job 5 years ago. You know, they just shouldn't be in that room. So that's kind of the model that I saw that existed there. Just everyone was doing a job. They were getting incredibly well paid for that job, but they were doing a job that they were doing 5 years before.
Interesting.
And in another company, they would be doing a job that was, they were learning, and they were sort of like pushing their knowledge, and operating more on the edge of what they knew. Whereas in Google, you're not operating on the edge of what you know. Certainly in the sort of areas that I were in, these people are like sort of overpaid for doing a job that is probably 2 tiers under them.
I see. Interesting. And so what job did you do when you were there?
So I was on the account side, so like the biggest spending advertisers sort of, and it was my job to kind of advise them on everything digital sort of at that point. But what was funny about it was, even though Google has all of these flexible hours and unlimited holidays and all this sort of side of it, you get asked the craziest questions. Just because you work there, you'll be in meetings with the managing director of Toyota, or the UK CMO of Toyota, the chief marketing officer, and they'll ask you how the Android store works because they couldn't download an app properly.
Did you have the answer for that?
I mean, but you're expected to have the answer to that, so it's really the answer to that is, are you real? Is this a real question? I'm getting paid a lot of money to answer this.
That's 2 tiers down.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a lot more tiers down. So it's a strange one, but it was a funny experience, to be honest, like being there, because I guess I always felt like, I mean, I kind of wanted, I'd worked in that sort of industry for a while in terms of advertising. It's one of these things that Google, that a lot of people forget. When you say to people like, what does Google do?
You're an ad engine.
And it's just, but I don't think the average person would know that, Yeah. So I think if you stop people on the street and said like, what's Google do? It's like, they're the biggest and most profitable advertising company in the whole world. Like that's what they are.
Yeah.
I think the statistic, and again, don't directly quote me on this, but I think it's something like 96% of their revenue comes through advertising.
They were making over $100 billion a year on people clicking on ads.
And that's it. It's pure clicks, right? That's what they're getting. And, now, I mean, they would say, obviously there's YouTube there as well. And, the people are sort of seeing ads, but like predominantly their revenue, I mean, I guess kind of like, the advertising and clicks, that's where all the revenue's from, right? And, it's just a lot of people don't know that, and I always struggled with this idea of you get Gmail for free, and you get Google Calendar for free, and you get YouTube for free, and you get to use the search engine. Google index the world's information. That was my Google hat on that. Google index the world's information. And you get to use that for free, and you get Google Maps, which Google Maps is amazing. Like it's like like I can't imagine the world before Google Maps. So from one perspective, you're like, wow, I get all of this stuff for free, and you're like, that's kind of cool. But then you're like, what am I paying for this? Because you're paying for it somehow, because no one's giving you something for free. And we call it in the sort of advertising world the freemium, economy. So it's like, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. And one of the difficulties with it is that what we can't yet quantify, in which, some people, we can go down the sort of psychology and mental health sort of industry, but people are trying to now quantify the impact of this. But there is a price that you're paying for that. You're just not aware of it at the time. And they can't state it in the terms and conditions because it doesn't necessarily come up on any rational and binary framework that we have at the moment to be able to quantify the value exchange of that. But ultimately what they're doing is they're learning about you, right? So, ask yourself the question, like, when was the last time you clicked onto the second page, when you search for something on Google?
Well, nowadays they don't even have a second page. They're getting that infinite scroll thing. There is no second page anymore.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's just that there's still, if you go on Google sort of on the desktop or whatever, and you go to it.
No one does that.
No one's ever done that. No one's clicking on the second page now. And then you're like, who's even clicking on the third or fourth link?
Yeah.
It's like people are clicking on the first one.
Which is a Google link.
Which is a very first one, because Google's getting paid for that, right? So, yep. But then you think, like, how amazing is that whatever phrase you type in that search engine, that very first thing that they punch up there, that's the thing that you're looking for, and you click it straight away, and that's the thing that you need. It's because they've got so much information from you and on you at that point, because their entire company relies on it, right? That's where all their profit comes from. You clicking on that link. So they give you all that stuff for free so they can learn all of that about you. And because they learn all of that about you, they know exactly what to put on that first thing. And then you click it and then they make money from it. Now, some people might turn around and say, well, that's great because I was looking for that thing in the first place. And they say, and I'm prepared to do that as a value exchange. But then we sort of try to correlate that with suicide rates are completely spiking right now. And I know this might be like quite a sort of a turn for the very beginning of the show.
We will definitely get to that too. But I was not expecting to shit on Google with you, although I'm happy to do it as much as you want. But I will say, I don't think I've heard a Googler come out of Google and say what you're saying. Normally what I hear is, it was a great place to work, the people are great, or something like that. Some generic, they probably read it on a script on the way out the door. This is what HR tells you to say or something. But from my perspective, I've always wondered, there's got to be some kind of nagging thing in the back of your head that goes, oof, what did I just enable while I was there? What did I create? And it sounds like you actually had that sensation. Like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, I see, once upon a time, we had the smartest people in the world, and they worked in politics. That's what they did. Smart people go into politics, like Socrates or whatever, these politicians and senates or whatever. That's where they went. And then eventually they went into money. They went into commerce, specifically the stock markets, banking, central banking, that kind of stuff. That's where all the smart people went. And then they went into ads. And now we have the smartest people in the world working on getting people to click on very tiny little banner ads on websites. And so I'm curious, like, what do you think the average person inside Google is thinking? Are they just like totally cool with what's going on there? Or are they more like you, they're more introspective?
So I think there's a link between all those things that you said, right? And it's power. So the industry might have changed somewhat. If you go back to the philosophers sort of our of those times, it was the most powerful, they were the most revered people, they were kind of looking at the real ideals of, how do you govern a society, and then when you said, or
build one from scratch.
Yeah, or like completely from scratch, and they're having those, the real deep dive philosophical sort of debates, that still we're talking about now, free will versus determinism and all of this sort of, you can go down this rabbit hole for ages. But that was kind of where the power was, And then that sort of shifted, as you said. And then obviously once we formed these ideologies, it was about, who's running that, and this was, whoever that might be, in terms of whatever your ideology might be that was running that. And then, as you said, after that, there was this shift, probably only in the sort of maybe 80s or so, where there was this sort of shift into the financial institutions, being given deregulation, massive amounts more power, in terms of where it is today. But and now when you're saying in big tech and stuff as well, but really it's still just chasing the power, right? It's just like the industry that they're in might have changed, but it's still the same thing, right? It's still, this is the whole ethos. I mean, Adam Smith wrote about this, a long time ago, in terms of like the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, right? It's just to constantly try and gain at the expense of other people, and then we're still here today, and I definitely experienced a case of like moral schizophrenia, let's call it that, sort of when I was there, that sort of I was on climate change protests of a weekend and stuff. I remember leaving the office early, to go and join a protest sort of in the afternoon, and sort of putting an out of office on, because I was at a protest, and then I was thinking, wow, but my day job is feeding this beast of it. And you're sort of trying to rationalize those two things of, well, hold on, I exist in this society, like I live in central London, like this is my life, I have sort of a cost of my life, and I'm earning quite well sort of from this. But then if I sort of just give that job up, like what else am I going to do? Like what am I going to do? Go and work at a non-profit, like, and so you're constantly sort of trying to balance this play off of it, and then I think a lot of people in this sort of Google world and in that sort of social media world, they're very much looking at the good, and because there's just not enough research on the bad,
That's because you're not looking.
and that's the thing, like
not a lot of research in not making money.
Yeah, and it's difficult, when people's morals are sort of questioned like that, but they're earning very well from.
Upton Sinclair had a famous quote about this. It's hard to get a man to believe or understand something when there's check depends on them not understanding it. I'm butchering it a little bit. That's the gist.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely that. And it's just, and then, you've got these Peter Singer type, modern philosophers and stuff that are sort of saying, well, actually, if you've got the opportunity to earn that amount of money, then you should just go and earn that amount of money, because you're contributing massive amounts of money into the sort of tax system. And yeah, I mean, that's sort of one way of looking at it, but you sort of have to question, for me, it came down, it got to a point where like I physically couldn't go in, I was just kind of, I was seeing these things of, mental health and kind of what was happening with consumerism and all of these, philosophical approaches that I had to life in terms of like less consumerism, and actually like, is capitalism the right system for us? And then when I really sort of started to deep dive into, economics and philosophy and that, it just became a thing that was just like completely in opposition to everything that sort of I felt in life. I started to then look at like, what's the cost here that people are paying for this? And are people even aware of it?
No, not at all. They're definitely not aware. Come on. People. Most people, the average person, you had an Uber driver on the way over. Do you think that Uber driver has any clue at all about Google's business model?
So no, he absolutely doesn't at all. But then, there are, Google Maps is amazing, right? It is amazing. I use it all the time, right? And if someone said to me, you need to pay for Google Maps, that it's going to cost you £10 a month. But what we won't do is we won't harvest your data and then sell it to the highest bidder. And that will mean that you're not going to get all of these ads that are going to come on you. Like, would you do that? I would do that because I can afford to pay that £10 a month. Now, some people can't afford to pay that £10 a month, so they're just not going to do it. But what they don't know is that those ads that are being blasted at them, that might give them a gambling addiction in the future, or that might give them a sex addiction because they're porn ads that are being blasted at them. But there's just not enough research at the moment with those correlations, because if they existed, I think that companies like Google wouldn't exist. Because it's always baffled me how people now, you know, you'll hear people about the strangest things, you know, like you'll ask somebody for, maybe I'm just giving a random example here, but like, I know that in the younger generation now, I have nephews and nieces that are sort of younger, so the sort of Gen Z sort of generation, they're really precious about giving out their phone number. So they give out their Instagram handle, like, rather than their phone number. And to them, that's a thing of like, no, I'm going to sort of protect my phone number. And you're like, you're protecting your phone number? That's what you're protecting. But you've got Instagram on your phone, and you've got Facebook on your phone, and Apple and Google and Netflix. And you know how much more information they have on you than just your phone number?
And they already have your phone
number. They've already got your phone number. They probably know you to a greater degree than you know yourself. Not probably. As a matter of fact, I know that for certain, that these companies know those people better than they know themselves. And in order to explain that to somebody, you know, to really try and explain it, I think a lot of people would rather live in the delusion, because it's too big a thing for them to get their head around. It's like looking at the sun and trying to get your brain to understand that that's a giant planet of fire, and that fire gives us all of the energy that sustains human existence. There's no possible way that like anybody in the world can rationalize that when they see a sunset. Nobody thinks about the giant ball of fire, planet of fire in the sky. No one does that. You know, they go, well, that's a beautiful sunset, right? That some things are just too complex for us to get our tiny little brains around. And I think this is one of them. You know, people are just unprepared to accept that because of how it would change their life.
Well, I'm definitely going to go look at sunsets differently. So, I mean, that's all very interesting. I think the average Googler, from what I can tell, is to some degree, I don't know to what level exactly, perfectly willing to put their head in the sand, perfectly willing to go, I'm just not going to think about this. And I have some anecdotal evidence of this happening. Like I've sat down with some very senior product managers, you know, in charge of very big chunks of the company and their product design, and I explain problems, like things that could easily be fixed that have absolutely no benefit at all from a security perspective and are definitely stealing people's privacy. Whether they are aware of that or not, I don't know. And those things, and this is, you know, 10, 15 years ago, those things still exist to this day. And the product manager was like, are you saying we should get rid of these things? Like, he's confused. Like, why would I remove something that's removing people's privacy? And I'm like, because there's no benefit to their security. And this is supposed to be a security thing that you're building. And no positive reaction whatsoever. And so I think to some extent, you're just not going to get a certain group of people to understand that removing their own paycheck is a wise decision, and maybe it isn't actually. Maybe there's some upside, but I don't even think they're ready to have the dialogue. I don't think that's a conversation they want to have. Period.
I mean, I think that a lot of people, you know, to go back to Chomsky and manufacturing consent, you know, like how many people that work at Google have read that book? You know, like how many people have read that book? You know, and a lot of people did read that book, right? But it's like today, you know, outside of, you know, philosophers and kind of like really deep academics and stuff, a lot of people are not understanding that. And he's literally saying that, like, I mean, I'm going to butcher this, you know, the sort of understanding of this book, but the way that I would explain it, because it was a really sort of a book that really changed my life. And, you know, I read it when I was young, and, you know, there's a very famous interview that Chomsky like gave with a journalist when he was talking about the book. And I always think that this is actually a better way of explaining the book actually through this. And this journalist basically misunderstood the book, and the book is actually like in my opinion, it's like it's a rallying call for independent journalism. He's saying how important independent journalism actually is. And this journalist clearly didn't really understand, you know, what he was saying. And this journalist is saying, so he asked Chomsky the question and says, so you're telling me that every question that I'm asking right now, I'm not freely thinking of these questions, but like that we've all decided as a team of people. And he says, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying the only reason you're sat there asking those questions is because people have judged your range of thought, and that the only questions that you can think of are within that range of thought. And that's why you were picked out of all of the people that applied for that job.
Ouch.
And it's just like, yes, like bang, like.
So is that why we have Googlers who are within that certain range? They get exactly a certain type of score or better, and now you're in?
And that's exactly what it is at every company, right? That's what they're doing, right? That is what the interview process is.
Yeah, I don't want to single Google out too much, but I think since we're talking about Google, it's useful.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that they're known as kind of like, but Enron was like this, right? In terms of the smartest people in the room and their sort of hiring process. And this whole thing is in every company, right? They're looking for a certain type of people, like when you think of investment bankers, you think they're hiring moral people for that? You think that like they're selecting people within the moral imperative? So they're absolutely not, right? They want people to go in there and be like, how much am I going to earn? Like, how many hours are there in a week, and what time are your offices open until? I'll sleep in the office, and they're like, yes, you're hired. So it's just, if there was some sort of like universal moral framework that you turned around and said, actually everyone should just be judged on this, moral framework, you've got at least got to have a foundation. Like whether people talk about now, some really amazing, ideas like universal basic income and all that sort of stuff. And these are amazing policies to bring in. But like what you've got to have, there's still going to be people implementing those policies, right? And what you should really, in my opinion, what we should really be looking at is like, what's the personal development of those people? What's their moral framework? Like, I want to understand how those people are morally developing, like what have they done to develop themselves personally, and then I'll put them in charge of implementing one of these systems, because the system in itself might be really moral, but if the person implementing that system isn't really moral, or isn't at least some sort of like foundation, or at least even understands what a moral framework is, right?
I don't know that I agree with that, and not because I think your premise is wrong, but I think you can design systems where the incentives are just perfectly in alignment with sociopaths. You can make it so that they are successful without being a detriment to the rest of the team. Like all boats can rise. You don't have to design out unethical people as long as you get the incentives correct. And so I think that's a failing of capitalism, and I think there's some really bad parts of capitalism and some amazing parts. But I think one decent critique is that people haven't spent enough time thinking about incentives. If you really, really focus on incentives, I think you can make moral systems by virtue of the fact that they just don't have a better choice. Like, I'm going to make less. Like, if I don't do the moral thing, I make less. Like, that's not going to work for me. I'm just going to do the moral thing because it's just more economically in my favor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Well, I
it's
guess
a game theory kind of thing.
Game theory, or in philosophy, is the big sort of debate between Sartre and Camus in terms of would you kill? I'm again slightly paraphrasing the question. I know that like all the philosophers out there are going to shoot me down on kind of like the individual nuance of the words within.
So many philosophers watching this podcast.
Yeah, but it's something along the line that the big question is. Sartre poses this: would you kill one innocent child to make the world a better place? And that's not exactly how he says the question, but Camus' rough response to that, and again slightly paraphrasing, is can you guarantee that you can make the world a better place by killing that one innocent child? Mm-hmm. Because if you can't guarantee that you make the world a better place by killing that one innocent child, you've just done something really immoral. Right. You've just killed an innocent child. So whether your intention was to do something really moral, make the world a better place, you just made a really immoral decision to do that. So then you'd have to question. So
what if it was a 51% chance and you could kill as many kids as you want, and then so statistically you're almost guaranteed to get a positive outcome. Just got to kill just one more kid, Yeah,
but that's the crazy thing in it. It's just kind of like, who's coming up with that? This is going to make the world a better place, or 51% chance this makes the world a better place. And then you're like, but you're going to do something that's really immoral to do that. So I'm probably not going to judge your moral rationality on telling me that decision is going to...
Or 49% chance immoral. You know what I mean?
But it's like, but even that, like, who's building those statistics? You know, who's building that? And it's just like, I want to know the moral framework of that person that's creating that. And unfortunately, we just don't do that as a society. You know, I mean, you can go all the way back to, you know, if you look at Aristotle and politics, and like, this is not a philosophy podcast, and I don't know.
Apparently, it is today.
And I don't know enough about philosophy to be talking on these topics, to be honest. But it's like the parts of it that I do know. Like I'm an avid amateur of, you know, philosophy, but I'm certainly not sort of you know, at, you know, educational level of it, let's put it that way, or certainly not to be educating others on it, you know.
And here you are.
And here I am doing it. But for the limited amounts that I know, it's kind of like Aristotle, when he comes up with democracy, and somewhere it gets proposed to him, as I understand it, of the electoral system. You know, somebody else comes up with this electoral system, and, you know, one quote that I remember was that you cannot govern people within a framework that they did not invent themselves, because that framework would be open to manipulation. That's the electoral framework, right? So, like, while democracy might have started off as something really beautiful, you know, giving power to the poor, like, unless those people are in control of the framework that implements that, then it's just going to be manipulated. And that's exactly what we have right now. So then you're like, well, how do you really do this? How do you really give people a free choice in this? Because the electoral system is obviously bullshit. And
without creating mobs.
Without creating mobs, but without creating just like complete
it's both problems. I mean, it's the twin problem. One is corruption, and the other is mobs. And we don't want either of those things. We want it to be an actual democracy. Because if you have, you know, let's say 100 cowboys, I think is the anecdote I heard, 100 cowboys, and 51% of the cowboys, 51 cowboys want to lynch somebody, does that mean it's okay? No, you got to have something above them that says, no, we have a rule of law. And who defines that rule of law? Well, that can't come from 51 cowboys. It's got to come from above that. You know what I mean? So that's the foundation of why pure democracy is probably not a wise choice, as opposed to pure representatives or whatever, where you have consolidation of power and corruption. So it's kind of the twin problems.
Absolutely. So representative democracy, I'm all in favour of. I'm all talking about the framework for implementing it. You know, so there was what example can I give here? Like, let's think about like, in my opinion, the greatest honour that can be bestowed onto any one person is the ability to remove somebody else's civil liberties. So if I was to say to you, you have the honour of removing all of my civil liberties. So my freedoms, whether I can go outside or not, you know, parents sometimes do this, you know, with children, you know, in terms of they ground them and they remove some of their civil liberties, right? And for that's like crime and punishment, you know, that's how they're teaching them. And we have that as well, you know, with our legal system, as you just wrote, you know, in terms of order on that. And you think that, to me, is the biggest single honour that can be bestowed upon anyone, or maybe honour, responsibility would probably be, you know, a more apt way of sort of saying it, in terms of I can be put in a position where, based on my moral imperative, I don't need a legal framework of this. That's what jury service is, right? That's actually what magistrates are in the UK. I don't know if you have the same thing in the US, but
not quite, but yes, close.
Okay. So yeah, they're just people, right, that go up there and they can remove civil liberties from people, which is wild. And then in jury service as well, you get a jury of 12 people they're just people, right? You know, they're not trained in law or anything, and they get to judge. They get to listen to a bunch of information. No one's judging their framework. You know, no one's judging how they analyze information. Do they even understand critical thinking?
That's not true. So in jury selection, they will ask you a bunch of questions, but really, they're both sides are trying to select for people who will give them either a guilty or not guilty verdict, depending on which side you're on. The one time I went into jury duty and that I wasn't immediately dismissed because, you know, the trial, you know, got mistrialed or whatever. I was talking to the judge about like all this background, all this crazy stuff in my history and whatever. And they're like, you are like weirdly, uniquely qualified to give advice on all kinds of crazy topics, like, so I think you can handle this, traffic issue or whatever. And I was sitting there talking to them, and the more I was talking to them, like, I know how those systems are built. I know all of the problems with those systems. Like, I know how those radar guns work. I mean, like, intimately, like, I totally understand how those things work. I know, like, how they work within vehicles. I know the problems with them monitoring certain vehicles as opposed to vehicles behind them, and on, like all these sub issues, and forensically how they actually wrote down this information, how the software works, how they actually got it on paper. Like, there's so many pieces of forensics that could have gone wrong between then and the courtroom. And I'm just like, actually, I think I'm uniquely not qualified to be here. And frankly, I think they were worried about me. They're like, this guy's going to go. We don't know which ways this guy's going to go. And he could totally swing the entire jury in one direction or another. So they dismissed me.
And I think you hit the key point there. They don't know which way you're going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're looking for is certainties,
yes.
right? They're literally looking for, who can I manipulate, right? They're looking for that Uber driver that doesn't know that Google's an advertising company. That's what they're looking for, because they can go, I can tell them this story and they're going to believe it. So you, as a sort of somebody that critical thinks and sort of like they're not sure what you're going to do, or you can swing it one way or another. You're a wild card. They don't want you involved in that, so they push you out. So it's not that when they're selecting for jury service, they're selecting people based on, these people know how to critical think, right? These people are rational thinkers.
Correct. It's the opposite.
It's the absolute opposite, right? They're going, these people I can manipulate, right? Yeah. It's the same way as, magicians will select their audience people, when they go round. I don't know if we have this British comedian, Darren Brown, he's a mentalist. I don't know if he's very big over here, but he does a lot of hypnosis type things, all these. And he's specifically selecting people for that, right? Who's going to go along with this, and he's looking for certain points of doing it. I mean, ultimately it's an illusion, but it's still on that same thing. But I think it brings up a really good point. And what the point that I wanted to make about jury service is, how were you selected for that? Like, what's the selection? But like,
how would I have been selected?
No, as in like, how did you get? I
think it was just because I was registered to vote, and therefore you're in.
And you just randomly got elected. You were completely randomly chosen, right? So the biggest responsibility that can be bestowed on an individual is random. You're just completely randomly selected, and you're like, well, that removes a shit ton of bias, right? In theory, that removes a shit ton of bias, because then people are coming there with their own cognitive biases and stuff anyway, and they might just look at that person and go, actually, that person's the wrong color for me, or the wrong religion for me, or the wrong gender for me, and because of that, I'm going to take out all of the experience I've ever had on my life on that person, even though they're not responsible for it. So I'm not saying it's without flaws, by the way. I'm not saying let's just randomly select everyone, but I just think it's funny that, or I think that it's an interesting paradox that the biggest responsibility, if we're agreeing on that, the biggest single responsibility that you can have, put on you, is your rights to remove the civil liberties of somebody else, and you're randomly selected for that. Yet we put politicians in power, that are making these decisions on behalf of our entire society, based on a framework that the philosophers that built our, the ideologies that govern our sort of society, they even said it was wrong, right? They literally said, well, this is
probably going to be some corruption.
There's probably going to be some corruption in this, and we just still go along with it. Like, I don't see very many people, like protesting in the street, like to get rid of the electoral system. Like I see people protesting for individual policy. Oh, I want this policy or that policy, or this should change, and that one's corrupt, and I'm all for that. But no one's really saying like, oh, hold on, the mechanism in which we decide politicians, that one's fucked. Like, we should really get rid of that and decide on a new one. And then we should have some sort of like big public, independent, like forum of really understanding like what framework do we want to use, because we seem to be randomly selecting people that can remove civil liberties.
So like Texas needs you to be a thing, also politics needs you to be a thing. And that is a conformist to one of two parties. And so neither party is going to be comfortable with the idea of going, cool, just do whatever you want. If you want to create a new party, you want to create some new politics, you want to completely get rid of, the Senate or Congress or what, they're never, ever, ever, ever going to agree to that. There are too many people who make too much money, and it really is a money and power thing. You're just never going to get anyone to say yes to that.
But when you say you're not going to get anybody to say yes to it, it's like it would benefit a shit ton of people, right? It's like at the moment you
still won't do it because their incentives are all messed up. It all kind of trickles down from the very top, obviously. The people who are driving it, who have the most power, the most money, and most access and influence are going to be telling people that this other party who wants to do this thing are, they're terrible. And here's and everyone has dirt. Everyone everywhere has dirt. And so they'll find something, go, oh, look, they actually did this terrible thing like 18 years ago. Or you shouldn't pay attention to them because they voted the wrong way one time on one bill. And, they're obviously, bad people for whatever XYZ reasons. You're never going to get the groundswell from the American public. I just don't think ever. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I mean, I'd love to say there'd be an independent party, the Green Party, or somebody in the middle, or libertarians or something, and right in the middle. I think they will never ever reach probably more than 5 to 10% of the population of votes.
And you've sort of got to be asking, like, is that designed?
Yeah, of course it is.
And do people want that? And
the powerful people want it.
And this is the thing, right? So you're not taught that in school. So why are you not taught? Why are people not talking about the Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith? Why are you not teaching that, or were you not teaching that to children? That hey, the reality of what happened is all of the people that they literally called themselves the masters of mankind. They all just got together and. Again, I'm going to totally just ad-lib sort of this, but they got together and said, we've got all of the stuff. And eventually the people that don't have the stuff are going to gather around and try and steal our stuff. And we should probably work out some sort of system that gives them the perception of equality without actually offering that equality. And then they built all of these frameworks.
Equality of opportunity.
So... But that's the thing, it's not equality of opportunity, right? Because if you start with all the stuff and then you're designing the rules in which you're going to be fair, it's like in the UK, there's a really famous story that I love about the Duke of Westminster. Like a lot of British people don't even understand the peerage system. They go and I saw the royal family, they drove around London in a golden cart, like a golden chariot, I had to actually look at it because my brain, again, when I look at the sun, I can't really understand it, a giant ball of fire. I was watching it on TV that there was a golden chariot that was riding around the centre of London in the middle of one of the biggest cost of living crises that we've ever had. And the people weren't in the street, trying to attack them and steal the gold. They were clapping and cheering. Hundreds of thousands of them, and they were having parties with money that they don't have because their mortgages have just gone up and the economy is crashing, but they were cheering them on. And I was thinking, what's happening here? Am I the crazy one?
Well, I think you are crazy because you could get on board and make a ton of money just clapping. You know what I mean? As long as you're clapping, you're gonna go on the upswing somehow. Or at least that's the perception. That's the promise. That's the check that will definitely not clear. It'll bounce. But it's a check nonetheless. You know what I mean? And so they're going to give it to you. We're going to offer change. We're going to offer more of this and less of this and more opportunity. And we're going to get rid of the people who you think are stealing your jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But they don't do that. The royal family don't do anything, right?
Not the royal family. No, but... Yeah.
So their policy is just don't say anything, and hopefully people sort of weird sort of cognitive bias and whatever they're holding on to of the old empire or something, that keeps them going.
True. The royal family is a bit of a different beast, but only kind of. I mean, they certainly could speak out. They could have a stance that says, "Hey, maybe we should fix the growing underclass. It's growing at a pretty sizable clip. Why don't we come up with some suggestions here? We won't necessarily, suggest policy, but we will facilitate conversations. I mean, there's ways for them to be neutral and still be useful.
And how's that worked out? Because Harry did that, right? So fair play to him. I'm a total anti-royalist and completely against the royal family in every single facet.
Okay.
But Harry actually did that, right? You know, so he sort of like, you know, he resigned from his position. I mean, I think there was a bit more nuance to the story and stuff of that, you know, but effectively he left his role of doing that, right? And, you know, he spoke out against that and sort of said, and I can imagine, like, you know, when he's talked about mental health conditions and he's talked about kind of what that did for his, you know, his just the way that he lived his life and kind of like, I mean, when your mum or when your grandma is on money, you know, that, like, can you imagine that? Like a picture of his grandma was literally on pieces of paper, and then imagine someone saying to him, like, do you understand the value of money? Or like, how much is bread and milk? And he was like, they hand over pictures of my grandma, you know, on bits of paper. Like, that's the reality of it, right? So it's just like, when he walked into a room, people bowed, you know, and it's just like, his grandma and, you know, his dad rides around the central London in the middle of a cost of like living crisis in a golden chariot, and they live in a giant house in the middle of central London that's surrounded by armed guards and like barbed wire fences, like big giant fences, you know, to keep all the scum out, you know, to make sure they don't get in. And that was his upbringing, that was his life, right? And you can understand how, like, you know, like, I mean, he said that he was been quite open with sort of his drug taking and things like that. But like, you have one psychedelic experience, and that's going to bring a whole new neural pathways to your brain, and you're going to start to go, "Is this right? Like, what, am I on this planet? Like, what's happening?
Is that my grandma on money?"
yeah, like, what a wild thing. But it's just like, that's the like, when I was saying this, it's like, that's the reality of it. It's just, there's a, you know, the peerage system that's in the UK, that people don't really understand this, of like dukes, like duchesses, and where all this come from. And it's just like, they were given out land because their ancestors went and killed people, right? That's what happened.
And raped and pillaged. Literally
raped and pillaged, colonized, like on top of that. And like, it's just the most horrific things that you can possibly do. There's a really like a amazing interview that was given, or a quote from the Duke of Westminster, you know, one of the wealthiest people in the UK. And again, I'm slightly sort of like paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, somebody said, could you give you know, younger people that some advice for how they might want to be you? And he literally said, be a descendant of William the Conqueror. Like, these people, like, it's just, we live in this generation now where people are watching these Netflix fantasy things of like Viking movies where people are cutting the heads off the people that live next to them, and then they're stealing their treasure, and they're gathering up more soldiers, and then they're going on to the next land, and then they're cutting their heads off, and they're stealing their treasure, and they're gathering up the land. And they forget that that's real. That shit really happened, right? Yeah. And then the only thing that happened after that is somebody in the UK, William the Conqueror, he just killed all of the people, right? So then he gathered all the money, and then all they did was they just wrote stuff down on bits of paper that said, by the way, you can't do this anymore. Like,
we were the last ones.
We were the last ones, which is really convenient, you know? It's just like, we now own all of the shit, and we've got a few preferences, and our preferences are, you can't steal our shit anymore. So if you cut my head off, I've written down on this piece of paper that it just goes to my next in line, so you're never going to get it. Mm-hmm. So no matter how many people you cut their heads off, you're never getting it.
So I've heard of modern day versions of this. So what'll happen is these real estate developers will go into these, I wouldn't say third world countries, but certainly not United States, like, you know, nearby South American countries, let's say. And they'll find some piece of coastline or some beautiful vista or something, and they're like, this is amazing. And it's just a bunch of like locals who live there kind of deal, but it's just incredible area. They'll buy up the entire area. They will build the most ridiculous, over the top, like, you know, like village or whatever, you know, like massive buildings and, you know, pools and whatever. And then they'll write a law as a writer right on top of it, as actually part of the deal with the city. This basically says you're never allowed to do this again. Like, they're it. And so they effectively just created a mini monopoly, not a monopoly in the traditional sense where you like, no one can ever do this in this country, but they don't need the country. They just need every single beautiful little spot, and they'll take them one at a time, slowly over time, and they just keep rinse and repeat. And it's such a good business model. It's actually become a bit of a problem because they have ended up, I wouldn't say stealing, but effectively stealing all the upside of owning the piece of property right next to it. And so all the people nearby are like, I would like to make a bunch of money on my property, which is now worth like a crazy amount theoretically by virtue of being next to this exclusive whatever. And they can't because they're locked out because of this law. Like no more big buildings, no more this. It can only be these little like favela type houses or whatever.
And I think you were right on when you said the word stealing. And that's literally what it is, right?
Kind of.
I mean, you could really go into, depending on like, whatever your political ideology is.
Stealing the rights, I would say, of the people nearby.
Yeah, but it's really stealing it, right? It's just like we've got to a point now where like the sky is owned, like the sea is owned, like even to a certain degree, like space to a certain degree is owned. And you're like, who owns that? Like who's deciding these things? And again, this is going all the way back to like this idea of, the average person on the street doesn't know how one of the biggest companies that have ever existed in human history and the most profitable company that is probably one of the most, if not the most influential company on all of society right now, in terms of like Google basically is the internet now, right? It's certainly the World Wide Web, right? That is Google, right? Wherever you go. People don't even know how it makes money. And you're like, wow, this is wild. Like, they don't know how it makes money and they don't care. And then you turn around and go, and then people will say, oh, I don't do psychedelics because it's against the law. And then you go, what's a law? Do you understand what a law is? Like, a law was somebody at some point decided something. They had a preference. And that person was in a high enough position within society that when they wrote that preference down on a piece of paper, they got people with guns or swords that if you didn't do their preference, they would stab you or they would shoot you. And that's literally what exists right now, right? So it's like the police...
Or arrest you.
Or arrest you, or take away your civil liberties, or fine you, They would take away your freedom, or they would like hurt you like economically. Mm-hmm. And that's how they enforce laws, right? And you're just like, it's just a preference. Like you think of all of the things now that are legal that were illegal 10 years ago, and then you think of all the things that are illegal now, and in 10 years time they're going to be legal. It's just like that's how stuff changes, but you still have people making decisions based on the law. I always find it really strange. I still really find this a strange thing because I think people think it's the law that's stopping them from doing certain stuff. I once was in a conversation with somebody who I'm not going to mention their name because they're a really beautiful person. And, but they were saying to me about like, imagine if it wasn't against the law to rape people. And I was like, I can imagine that world, right? They were like, well,
that was the way it was for millions of years.
But I was like, well, do you think there would be a shit ton more rapes? Because do you think that the thing that's stopping people raping somebody is that somewhere in a library, there's a book that is written down on a piece of paper that says, you can't rape someone because if you do, you're going to go to prison for between 3 and 7 years. Is that the reason why when you look at someone, you don't rape them? Because there's a book that exists in a library somewhere and that you know what the consequence of that? Mm-hmm. That's not the reason why you don't rape somebody. Like, it's such a mental idea of that the governing laws of order in our society are based on
I think
or the governing dynamics of our society are based on laws. So.
I think that some percentage of rapists won't rape by virtue of that law. I think some percentage won't rape because they fear direct ramifications of big men coming to their door and just beating the shit out of them. And I think some will just decide they want to be ethical people, and the rest will just rape. And that's just how it's going to end up happening.
Well, so it's really interesting because
some small amount of people will obey a random thing somewhere in some book.
So, but it's because even when you started that, right, like it's like cognitive bias, you said some rapists won't rape because, right, because if the person's a rapist, they're a rapist, right? So
or maybe the word is wrong in that context, but potential or rapist.
So you think that some people, like, you think that one of the governing dynamics of a person deciding that they're not going to rape somebody is because they've weighed up the consequence of doing that. They've gone, hold on a minute, I'd really like to rape this person, but I could potentially, if I get caught, lose 3 to 7 years of my life. And I know that that's a law. And in this moment, when I'm feeling like that, I'm not going to do it because of that.
Yes. I think there's some small percentage of people who do. Yes.
I mean,
there's enough sociopaths out there who have that exact calculus.
I mean, I would strongly argue against that, but I'm open.
Small. I'm not saying it's
like 12.
Well,
we definitely should not be laughing about this topic, by the way.
I don't think it's 12.
We're not laughing. Obviously, we're not laughing at rape. That's horrific.
I would say 12% might be a number. Though.
I mean, that's there's no way in the world. What there's like 8 billion people in the world. So let's
no of rapists.
Of
potential people who would commit a crime. Yeah.
I think that it's just. There's this thing of like even like human rights and I know that I'm gonna keep talking about philosophy and I really don't feel qualified to do this, but like, you know, one of my favorite philosophers, Simone Weil, is just like an incredible human being, and it's just like I implore anyone that if they
let me give you another example. That might change your opinion on this.
Let's go.
So I've done this anecdote many times with many very senior security people. And I'll just kind of paraphrase it. So let's say we were at this Mexican restaurant as the first time I came up with it. And people were talking about, whether you should worry about inside or, whether you should worry about the external threat or whatever. I'm like, okay, imagine you have a briefcase and this briefcase is filled with $5 million. And everyone in the restaurant, every single person in the restaurant can tell that there's $5 million in this thing. And we say it out loud. There's $5 million. This is not a drill. This is a real $5 million. And then we have our goodbyes and we forget it. If you believed that this group of people felt that they could get away with it, that's the big caveat. How many people do you think would steal it? And the numbers varied. Some people said as low as 30. Some people said more than 50, maybe even 60%. That's the highest I've heard. I'm like, okay. Now, if you go inside of a company and you have billions of dollars associated with, your accounts or whatever, and you believe that somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population will steal money if they think they can get away with it, you're really talking about the detection mechanisms to get that number down to zero and or the penalties if you catch them. And so that's the second part. That's I would say 12%. I think that's probably close to the right number, actually. I think the real number is hard to calculate, but I do think people weigh up the ramifications of being caught. And like, under normal circumstances, if this were just a fantasy world, no problem. I could go ahead and do it. If this is a video game, I probably would click the do the bad thing button, but it's not a video game. And I don't want 3 to 5 years of my life being tortured. You know what I mean?
So I think we're talking about two totally separate things here, okay. And I think there's a really big distinction in terms of what you said there, because money is just bits of paper with pictures on it, and those bits of paper with pictures on it, you can trade it because that's the society that we built, right? And we turned around and said that, if you've got these bits of paper, you can trade it for a much better life, and they've seen people doing it, and that's absurd. Right? There's an absurdity in that. You're not trading your time. You're not trading your values. You're trading bits of paper. That's different from an actual person that's involved. So I'll ask sort of a similar question or phrase slightly differently. But a pimp, a guy that is forcing a woman into prostitution. I think when we ask lots of people that question, almost everyone is going to say that's wrong, right? I would say it's going to be way less than 12% of people that are openly going to agree with that, right? It's going to be... Yes,
although prostitution is extremely prevalent.
Yeah, but I'm saying someone that's being forced into doing it by a guy, that's different from somebody. So if we're saying sex workers and free choice, and we can go down a whole total rabbit hole with that, because I would argue that they're not having free choice in a moral society. But let's just put a pin in that, and let's just say someone that's being forced into doing it, right? I would say almost everyone is going to disagree. They're going to say that's wrong. Right? That shouldn't happen. Now, is the reason why they're saying that shouldn't happen is because that woman has a human right to decide what she wants to do for a living, right? Because there's a law that exists somewhere, right? There's a human right, or there's a law that prostitution is illegal. Is that the reason why they're saying that's wrong? They're not. They're saying that's wrong on a different level, right? They're saying that's wrong on some sort of consciousness level where we just know that's not.
I'm not sure that that's true. Whoa. I mean, no, I'm not. I'm really not sure that's true. It's a cultural thing also. I mean, if you go to Amsterdam, for instance, are you gonna get the same numbers?
No, but this is different. I'm saying someone that's being forced into doing it rather than doing it from their own choice.
Well, okay, all right. You did carve out.
Yeah, so we put a pin in that. So let's
okay.
go back to that at some point, because I know what you're going to do. You're going to argue the deterministic versus free will. Are they actually doing that based on their own free choice? But let's go back to that.
Okay, all right. So if you exclude anybody who outwardly volunteers that they're doing it intentionally, I think the problem with doing that is you actually exclude the majority of people who are in sex work that are actually being trafficked and just don't understand that that's what's happening. So I don't think it's a minor carve out. I think you're basically carving out the cohort I'm talking about. You're just like, nope, they don't count. Except for, I had somebody on the podcast, a couple of guys. I'm spacing on Penn Parrish and Joe Scaramucci. And they were talking about this exact issue. And a lot of women who get in sex work, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but a lot of women who get in sex work
this is not a bit of a rabbit hole, by the way. This is we should definitely not be two white men drinking whiskey discussing these topics right now.
I think it's well within scope. But I think that the problem is a huge chunk of them are basically seduced is kind of a weird way to phrase it, but effectively told that the life is going to give them one outcome and they're going to go to parties and it's going to be great and oh, you're so beautiful, and they're groomed into that position. It's not quite like the movies make it out, where they're like, chained up in a basement or something. I mean, I'm sure that does happen to some extent, but that's actually the minority. The majority is people who are just given another life that they think is more glamorous. So you really do have to get you can't carve them out, unfortunately, I think is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so, but on that point, I think it's really important to say that like what you perfectly described there was male gaze, right? And you turned around and said, they think that this life is more glamorous. Where do those thoughts come from? Those thoughts come from the entirety of Hollywood was invented by white men. Like we wrote all of the movies, we directed all of the movies, we produced them, we edited them, we owned all of the studios.
Chris is definitely to blame for all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like,
Hey, be careful there. Hey.
I mean, it's a cycle. I mean, even in Disney, right? Like Chris said, he was at Disney for a long time, and you look at Disney shaped an entire narrative, of a whole generation of people, in terms of this prince and princess and heterosexual sort of relationships, and this idea of the man has got to be the strong one and slay the dragon, and the woman is the damsel in distress, and this sort of side of it. And Hollywood did this, and they still do it now, right? And
that predates Hollywood, though. I mean, those are fairy tales largely.
Yeah, I mean, like the first known pretext of this is Tristan and Isolde. We could go all the way back to sort of Tristan and Isolde.
Or Beowulf, there's a lot of versions of this story.
Yeah, no, like I think all of those sort of things, but it's all of that.
Canterbury Tales.
Yeah, man must be man, and woman must be damsel in distress, sort of thing. And now we're at this point.
We've inherited a lot of great stories. It wasn't Disney.
But then you kind of go like, with this male gay society that we're in right now, and a lot of people don't even know where it exists, and you sort of go, where does it stop, right? So I watched this horrific movie called Ad Astra, like with Brad Pitt in, and it was, I honestly couldn't believe that this movie was made, because it's just the absolute antithesis of male gaze. It's like, white man has some problems with his dad, and because of that becomes a really sort of not a very nice guy within his relationship, and like really he's not in touch with his emotions, all this sort of stuff, and then he goes to fucking space to like reconnect with his dad or on some bullshit mission or whatever. And he does this like his whole life. And that guy's Brad Pitt. And he's like, I don't know, how's Brad Pitt now? Like, you don't never know with any of this biohacking shit. It's like, he could be,
he's about 100 years old.
He could be 100 years older. He could be like, I mean, he looks like 21, right? So he's like, he still looks like the most beautiful person that the world's invented. And it's just like, so Brad Pitt like fucks off to space to like, you know, deal with his childhood trauma and like meet his dad or whatever. And then just like waiting around for him for all of the years that he's there just happens to be this beautiful Liv Tyler that's like half his age and just like the most stunning woman that you've ever met. And she's just like moping around, like, you know, going to Starbucks and doing yoga and stuff, like just desperately waiting for her, like a guy to come back. And I'm just like, that's actually what Hollywood did, right? And it's just like, when was the last time you saw a movie where the leading lady in that movie is double the age, or, you know, 20 years, or there's a massive age gap, you know, between that and the male love interest in it? And then you look at society and you turn...
Well, that movie is going to be a predatory movie or funny. It's going to be a comedy. I mean, they'll write it, but it'll be a comedy.
And then you look at society and you go, but that happens a lot in society, right? So it generally is like, you know, women tend to be with older guys. And then you go, well, how much of that is true because of male gaze, and how much of that is true because of the media that they're seeing? And when they're flicking through magazines, they're seeing the older guy. Like, buy any beauty magazine now, or GQ, or whatever it is, look at the models on those things, you know, and it's just like, look how much, try and guess, or just Google, you know, like how much, or you can use any search engine you want. But it's just like,
are you a Bing user?
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's just, but like, how much older is that guy than that girl in that thing? And now imagine, like, how weird would it be if it was the opposite way round, you know? And now imagine a woman that's that guy's age and a guy that's, you know, the girl's age in that, and you're like, that just, it would like break the understanding of most people's brains of how society works.
We have a mutual friend of a friend, who has the woman is dating a younger man, or married to a younger man, a couple kids, and she is quite concerned about the public perception associated with her dating down in age. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a pretty big stigma associated with it, despite the fact that, I mean, visually it's no big deal. Like, you're not like, what is going on here? It's not like he's a child or something, you know? It's like there's a couple years different, you know, no big deal.
But even if you go with that, right, it's not like he's a child or something.
Right.
And then you think of like Leonardo DiCaprio openly dates like, you know, like 22, 23, 24-year-old sort of like models and stuff, and they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But people like make jokes about it. Like, you know, Ricky Gervais made like famous jokes about it at, you know, the Golden Globes and stuff. And it's like, but then he laughs, and everyone in the crowd is sort of laughing and stuff like that. And you're like, imagine if it was the other way around. You know, it's just, it wouldn't work the other way around. It doesn't work. Like, it's not funny. Like, it's a serious thing. But then, I guess what I'm saying, or like where we're going to, we've massively sort of jumped so many topics and stuff on this, but like to bring back to, like,
that's the Arsenic Show right there in a nutshell.
But to bring, I mean, this started of me talking about Adam Smith and sort of saying, actually, like the peerage system and all this sort of stuff, and like how all of these people out there are sort of supporting something that they don't really even understand. And it's like, hey, if you actually understood it, you should be fucking burning it down. You know, you should be protesting in the street. You know, these people are the living antithesis of everything that is wrong about society, but you just haven't learned that.
Okay, all right. With one caveat, there's the gate analogy that I really, really like. A guy says, there's this gate here in this road, and it's, you know, blocking stuff. He's telling this other guy, and so I want to get rid of it. And the guy is like, okay, what is it for? He's like, I don't know. He's like, then you can't get rid of it. And that's I think the cautionary tale. It's okay if you want to burn stuff down, but you better know how it works first. And I think that's the big problem. There's a lot writing on getting it wrong.
I actually genuinely don't think there is now. So again, like to bring it back to
you don't think there's anything good that's hanging off of it?
Absolutely zero. Like,
really?
And there's, I mean, if we're talking about the royal family in particular in the UK here and stuff,
sure,
literally zero. Like, there is like any study that's been done to say that the royal family, I mean, the only argument I've ever heard sort of put to me about this is that they bring in lots of tourism revenue. And then you look at like who's doing those studies, you know, and like those studies are being paid for either by the government, you know, that has an interest in doing that, or by them themselves or some subsidiary of them and stuff. It's just not true, right? Because loads of other countries don't have royal families and they're all okay as well. So it's a mental argument that like people put in there. Like it's a lot more to do with the disassociation of society and the marginalization of people, right? That's how they drive divisions, you know, between them. So it's like, you know, one of the crazy things that people don't understand about racism is that during like slavery, when it happened in the UK, when people would escape from that, it was often the lower socioeconomic groupings, you know, the working class, that helped them escape, you know, that put them up and like help their struggle. And then you're like, well, how now is there massive amounts of racism? And you're like, what is that? That's poor, disenfranchised people. And poor disenfranchised people, and there's people above those that have lots of power and money and interest, and they've gone, hold on a minute, if those people all get together because they're all poor and disenfranchised, they might start to create new political ideologies and come and like redistribute all of our wealth that we've got over here
and burn us down.
And burn us down. So they've gone, it's much better to drive division in between them, and we'll do this with pseudoscience, in which they've done throughout history. I mean, we go all the way into like the Hamites and the European Egyptians that were there before actual Egyptians, and there's so much bullshit that's been put in there. But like people believe this, and we now live in a generation where we've got an internet or we've got a World Wide Web that is completely unregulated. The social media are allowed to act with complete impunity.
I have a question for you. So the one thing I've heard the royal family is good for is people are like, it's kind of weird that your president, you know, it's a political figure, is the head of the country. And this is coming from a very European perspective. Like the nice part about a royal family is you have some diplomat who can go and shake everyone's hand and no one gets mad at. So there's always some sort of level above the politics where people can sort of still hang their hat and say, oh, there's something good about this country. There's some person who's a figurehead above, you know, the super partisan politics right below the surface. And I don't necessarily totally agree with that, but I think that's an interesting perspective. What do you think?
I think that you described that perfectly in terms of like, they're a symbol, you know, that's what they are. They're a picture on a stamp, right? And like they can be paid for being a symbol, you know, in the same way that like companies get paid to build logos, you know, and it's just like, that's what they are. It's like they're a logo. But they certainly shouldn't be getting paid and have the privileges. You know, when the Queen died, she didn't have to reveal how much money she had. That's a real thing, right? They literally have like a private law that says the royal family do not have to publicly declare it, because inheritance tax, everybody when they die, they have to declare how much money, because it's like a fair thing, because of the taxation and stuff like that. That doesn't apply to the royal family. And then you're like, why are they like, why do they not have to declare it? Because if people knew how much money they had, they would go, wait, we pay these fuckers? And they've got all that money? Like, this is the most mental thing. Like, but people just don't know it. And we don't teach people it, you know, like we don't teach people that this idea of like princes and princesses, and Disney has like really fucked this up with the whole thing of like, oh, now you've got girls, like young girls growing up, I want to be a princess and I want to be this. And then they look at royals and they look at them as though, oh, I want to be that. And you're like, their ancestors raped and pillaged people. It's like, that's how they got there. It's horrific, you know, like read a book, you know, it's like, why aren't we teaching this in school, you know? And then while, like, you know, when we went off to sort of try and do a bit of a summary and bring us back on, you know, where we were earlier on, I was saying like, with regards to what we do, right, and digital technology and data, like there's probably like a fundamental philosophical sort of question about like, you know, we could have a really interesting sort of conversation about determinism versus free will. Right, and
I would love to do it, but we will really burn through time. You're okay doing it?
No, I mean we can go, and it's just like we need some more whiskey.
The thing is, I definitely want to talk about mental health, and I don't want to burn through. You know what? Screw it. We'll do this, and then we'll do mental health. Okay? Yeah. Because I really you have some interesting stuff to talk about with mental health, and I think that's worth spending a pretty good chunk of time on. So, out of curiosity, where do you land? Free will or determinism? And why?
It's a thing of like what I know versus what I would like to believe.
Okay.
You know?
No. Oh, so you have proof. All right, good.
Well, I have proof because I've worked at the biggest advertising company in the world, right?
Okay.
So it's just like I know that they go, this person bought a pair of Nike trainers. Let's go and find us other people that look exactly like that, and then they go and find other people that look exactly like that, and we can work out. And a lot of people don't understand this process, but this is literally how all of the ads that you see sort of work online. So someone buys a pair of Nike trainers. And some strategist somewhere or some data analyst, looks at this and they go, when did that person start thinking about buying that pair of sneakers? How long ago was that? When did the first thought come into their head of, I want to buy a new pair of sneakers? And it's their job to try and work that out, right? We call this a consideration window. And they go, how long ago? Was it 2 weeks ago? What's the first bit of evidence? What's the first clue that we've got? What did they Google? What did they watch? Like, when did they decide to buy this? Now, some people might be out there going, "Oh, but it's impulsive." People do this, and it's like it's not, right? It's like some of those decisions are impulsive, but if they impulsively bought something, I would still argue that impulse was still based on a whole bunch of data that happened before that. Mm-hmm. And it's like we can see this, like when people buy houses, when people buy cars, when people buy trainers. If you go into any ad agency and they will talk to you about funnels, put people in the top of the funnel and then people will buy at the bottom. And those funnels, based on different products, have different consideration periods of time. And then during that, we then plot on a graph and we go, on this graph, these are all the touch points that we had to interact with that person. And then we go, which of those touch points, and when I'm saying touch points, this might be like websites that they've read, things they've watched on YouTube, it might be whatever, a whole variety of different things. And then we say, which of those was the most important? Because after that, what did they do after? So they watched that YouTube video, and then what did they do? And then we try and score it, right? And this is playing into your world, right? So you're going to be able to tell this a lot better than I can. But basically, we give it a 0 and a 1. And then we turn around and go, that bit was really important, that was really important. And then what we do is we call them attribution models. And then we have a massive, massive amount of money. And then we upweight all of these bids. So the reason why you're seeing that ad before your YouTube video is because somebody like me decided that you should see that, because I'm bidding more for it than everybody else. And the reason why you see that link at the top, or the reason why you see that banner, is because somebody has decided that you need to see it because you're a specific set of data that's happened. That's all you are. You're just a specific set of data. And you buy that, and these companies earn billions from it. And they have a massive ROI, a return on the investment of advertising, because people have sat down and they've built deterministic models that decide these people. So I'm saying I've seen it. I've seen determinism in the way that we describe it right now. A whole series of manipulation that make you do something that you think is a free choice. Somebody bought a pair of Nike trainers and they think they actually decided to buy that pair of Nike trainers, and you're like, that just didn't happen. That's just, the advertising industry wouldn't exist if you were that impulsive.
All right, so it sounds like you're saying you believe in determinism, but you said what you want to believe. So why do you want to believe in free will?
Because it's really sad. Because it's really sad. Like, I want to believe we can change this. I want to have hope. I'm a rational optimist. I want to believe we have hope, and like I do believe, that people have, that the reason why people don't, go and commit certain crimes, particularly when those crimes are harming another individual. That those crimes are not like, when we talked about money versus, you gave the example of stealing money versus harming somebody. Mm-hmm. The difference there is that it's an inanimate object versus an actual person, right? And somebody might track that money all the way to the top and they go, who's getting hurt?
I think there is a difference, but it's the population is unfortunately not that much different. It's a pretty similar number, and the people are very similar.
Yeah, like
if you just look at the population rate of prostitution in the United States, and they've got to have clients, and that's a group of people who are willing to harm somebody else for money.
Yeah, but that's in a different way, right? So they're not, maybe through some sort of cognitive bias, they're tricking themselves.
Okay, all right.
This.
There's all kinds of ways you can talk your way out of it. It's still a very similar population, though.
Yeah, it is. But I'm saying that like it's a bit the same way as, these people, by giving them money, and that person being there, they've probably got some sort of cognitive bias of like, actually, like, I'm helping this person, I'm giving them money. You can rationalize it in lots of different ways.
Of course.
That's very different from like, I know this person doesn't want this to happen to them, and I'm going to still inflict this on them. I'm going to murder this person for money, and that's a lower percentage of the population, massively low percentage. Or I'm going to inflict, some sort of, pain on this person, just for my gain. That's a real small percentage, of people versus people that do things where they're justifying to themselves that there's.
Out of curiosity, what do you think that population size is as a percentage? If you were to guess.
You're going to tell me, so like you.
No, I would guess it's about 5%.
Of the people that would.
5% of the population will intentionally harm somebody else for personal gratification. In some way.
I think it's lower than 5%. I think it's a lot lower than 5%. I would,
if they could get away with it. Sorry. Let me be clear about that.
Yeah, but again, there it's like, how do you quantify that? Because like some people
I'm just saying, if self-reporting, I think you could get that number as high as 5%.
Yeah, but self-reporting is very different from somebody actually doing it. It's like the amount of people that would talk about like, if there was a terrorist attack, this is exactly how I would sort of defend it on a plane. Whereas, the people that are like, oh, when slavery was on, I would have been there building the Underground Railroad. And it's like, no, you wouldn't. Like, there's like the actual percentage of people, it's like, it's almost no one, that sort of does that. Okay. So I would think it would be very low. But what I was saying with the deterministic side is like, I want to believe that people have free will. But other than like consciousness and spirituality, like I know there are some things that people just don't do just because they know that's wrong, and I don't know where that comes from. And like I brought Simone Weil into it.
Some of it is Disney movies, as you said. I mean, it's definitely cultural.
But then that's deterministic, right? So you're saying that they're only doing it.
Well, I mean, if you go to some Papua New Guinea tribes, for instance, they will consume other people. You're not going to do that in a steakhouse in New York, but you will do it in Papua New Guinea if you're part of a cannibalistic tribe. That's just part of the thing, and sometimes it happens. And enough people have done it that approximately 100% of certain tribes have eaten human flesh. So are you saying that it's completely deterministic or completely free will that they are eating humans?
Yes, like I would assume in that case that
I mean, that seems like you could make a case that humans are not bound by internal guidance. They're bound by society.
So in that scenario, I would imagine that the majority of people that are doing it now, or almost all of them, are doing it because people did that before them, right? So in that sense, it's deterministic, right? Mm-hmm. So they're influenced by their society.
Right.
I guess the question we'd be going back to of like, did somebody have a free choice at the start of that, right? And and that's kind of where I'm getting to now. It's kind of like, what things do I think are deterministic in terms of decisions that people make each day, that I can look at them on an aggregate level, that I can look at big data and I can go, how many of these people do I know fall into that category? How many of them fall into that socioeconomic group? How many of these people do I know are going to make this decision versus that decision? They're going to vote for that party versus that party. And what Cambridge Analytica style, deterministic things can I do? This is literally the way that the majority of the world works, right? So it's like the entire consumerism industry, the advertising industry, the marketing industry, political strategists, like the entire political thing. It's all worked on determinism. Like all of this is deterministic, right? That's literally why you have polls on TV, right? Where's Jupiter going to be? What's the weather going to be? This is all deterministic, right? So then I'm sort of going, where's the free will, right? So it's just like, what are we freely in control of, like, or what do we freely decide? And it's like, I said, I want to believe that that it's true, and I do believe that like we are freely deciding not to hurt other people, like to a to a massively more majority than the people that decide against that. And I don't believe that is based on the deterministic factor of there is a law saying that we shouldn't do that. I think that's our free choice that's doing that.
I think you lost me at that last part, but every other part I agree with. I unfortunately know enough about enough things in the universe that I kind of move almost exclusively into the direction of determinism.
Oh, wow.
Almost exclusively. And there's only a few things that I'm willing to have a comma that maybe there's some free will there. Maybe. And it's a big comma. And that would be down to the quantum level. And so, yes, maybe a bit can go this way or this way. Maybe one photon from a high energy particle coming from space can go and hit my brain in exactly the right way and flip me from deciding to mow someone down on the street and not doing it. I mean, maybe that's how it works. But that's the level we're talking about. That's the free will. Where it's almost more like roll of the dice than it is true cognitive free will.
Okay, well, I feel like we need just a philosopher just to be sort of sat in the corner of this, just like
cry foul.
Constantly just be checking our sort of philosophy over here and sort of saying, actually, people had these conversations 300 years ago.
I'm more of the super determinism, where if you were able to properly map the pool balls of the universe, God starts or whatever starts the universe, clicks the pool balls, they go in whatever direction they go. I think that that could be clicked a billion times in a row, and it's always going to go the exact same way. Now, what might be different is in the beginning of the universe or whatever, maybe some spiritual cognition or whatever allows us to click it in a slightly different way, and now we mow down the kid or don't mow down the kid, or maybe there's spirituality above it in a seventh, eighth dimensional plane, because that's kind of how these things work in dimensions. That might have some say in a fourth dimensional universe, which is where we live, and say, nope, I want you to not mow down the kid because I'm an ethical, spiritual being. And it's more like a book where you can flip the pages, or actually it's probably more like a web page where you can edit the web page and say, nope, I'm not going to do that. And maybe that's the quantum. Maybe that's where the quantum gets in and says, okay, no, you're actually that high energy particle is going to hit you right that perfect second, or you're gonna have a Hawking particle decay, and all of a sudden your neuron is going to go this way or this way. And sure, maybe that's possible. But if you look at everything in the natural universe, everything has correlation and causation. Everything. You can't point to anything other than human cognition. And the only reason I believe that's true is because we just don't know very much about the human brain yet. We're still working on it. But if you look at ChatGPT, which is a weird hybrid kind of variant of what a brain might kind of sort of look like, kind of ish, purely deterministic. And the funny thing is, all the scientists working on it are like, we don't know how it works like this. We don't know how it came up with this. Well, that's because you don't know the role of each individual dice. And that's not because it's not possible to know. It's because you haven't instrumented it to give you exactly all this information. It'd be hugely expensive to do this, like hugely expensive. If I wanted to know the role of the dice, to get every single answer out of every single thing that came out of ChatGPT and why it chose this word versus this word, like it would be computationally like off the charts. There would be no way to store this amount of data. So they just don't do it. But that doesn't mean it's not deterministic. It's like very, very deterministic. I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I guess to go on the free will thing, what you've effectively got to prove here is randomness.
Yeah.
You've got to prove that there's enough randomness that's out there that it can't be computed, right? So we could go to living organisms, right? As in, like, we have no idea. Like, so the Big Bang Theory and any theory that I've ever heard sort of is just as absurd as each other, right? So I think that the Big Bang Theory is just as absurd as, religion and, a guy living in the sky sort of thing, right? We have no idea on that.
We have no idea.
But the deterministic sort of, I guess, argument to that is we just don't have enough data, right? And at some point we will work this out.
Or not.
Or not. Or maybe this is too much. But then it's just like, to prove the randomness of it, it's like it's my understanding that on any given day, a human being makes about 30,000 choices. Obviously, there's no way that we can rationally make, using critical thinking in terms of 30,000 choices every single day. But it could be anything. Am I going to pick up this cup right now? What time do I wake up? Like all of these different things. So there's a certain order that you're making those 30,000 choices in, so which is different to other people. You decide to get up, and when you sleep in a certain way, and you might drink, a drink as soon as you wake up and brush your teeth, but you make roughly 30,000 choices every single day. So now by the time you've lived like 3 days, that's already like a number that we don't know, because if there's going to be nobody else that's lived those exact 30,000 choices in that exact same order for that exact 3-day period. And then by the time you keep growing up and blah, 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 and you add more days and stuff like that, they're numbers that we cannot compute, right? There are lots and lots of different choices, which is why seemingly you get...
Seems random.
So this is the thing, but then you could always have that argument, right? It's just like, because if we quantify it still as dots on a graph, and which is the way that we're looking at it, which is kind of, okay, if that's 30,000 choices, then there will just be dots on a graph. And like, if we keep plotting it, and eventually you'll be able to build some sort of graph that will have a certain telemetry on that. And then we can project that out going forward, and we can go, these people are going to look exactly like that. To a certain degree, I get the sort of the deterministic sort of, and I'm not arguing either way here. I'm not wed to a side.
Yeah, me neither.
And
I am a true agnostic.
Yeah, and I'm like that with everything, right? It's just like it's all random, like it's all chaos, and it's just like we're the silly people that try to find answers in that, and that's mainly based on our education system that we have. It teaches people what is right and what is wrong, right? And rather than teaching people the mechanisms to decide for themselves what is right and wrong, so we grow up in this system of there's answers to everything, because that's what we're taught. We're not taught when we go to school, like, hey, by the way, like, there's fucking no answers to a lot of the important questions that are out there. Like, we have no idea why, like, someone's going to fall in love with you. Like, a deterministic argument is someone could turn around and say, there's these 15 things that will help, if you're smart and you're good looking, you go to the gym a lot and you earn a bunch of money and stuff, these things will help. But ultimately, we know that's not true, because there's a whole bunch of other examples. Yeah,
but you also instinctively, like, even Hollywood can't write this right. You rewind the tape and you play the same tape over and over again, they're not going to choose a different person the next time. They're going to choose you over and over again, because every single sequence of events is identical. Like, even Hollywood can't say, oh, there's such a significant change in the sequence of events that they'll choose a completely different partner, unless they, butterfly effect, they went into the environment and, spilled some coffee or something. Okay, fine. That's no longer deterministic, though. Like, you instinctively know that if you were to replay the last 10 minutes, you're going to say the exact same words. Like, that that's true. And why is that true? And, that sounds like determinism.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of...
let me give you another example.
Yeah,
this is the one I've been playing with a lot in this. So let's say somebody who's a troubled youth, right? Like, they've had a bad life. And you rewind the tape and you're like, oh, well, what happened in their life? Well, they had shitty parents. They were abused, drugs and alcohol in the house, physical abuse by not just them, but also next door neighbors and, bad boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever. And you're like, yeah, well, that makes sense, right? You don't blame that person for being kind of a troubled youth. You're like, that was a determinist. They were determined to turn into this person. That was the whole setup of their environment was set up to make them fail. So you're not surprised that they fail. In fact, you might be surprised that they come out of it. That might be the surprise, right? Like, oh wow, they just ended up being an amazing person as a result of all this, trauma in their house. So in one sense, we're like completely, this is deterministic universe. We know that if you apply this recipe, people are going to turn out badly. However, we're also like super happy and accustomed to the idea of comeback stories. We're like, oh no, but like this, like it's amazing, this horrible circumstance, and then they turned out amazing. But that's just the randomness of the universe as much as it is anything. right? Like they could have easily stayed exactly as bad as they were. They would have been the statistic and we would have just forgotten about them. It's only by virtue of the weirdness of the randomness of the universe, and I mean random in a colloquial sense, not in the literal sense, that somebody comes out the other side. They're like completely awesome human being. You're like, wow, like that's crazy. But if you rewind the tape and you ask them, like, what happened? Like, oh, I saw this one video that made me change my outlook on life. That's determinism.
Yeah, so I guess because random is free will, right? That's what free will is. Free will is in my understanding.
Hopefully not. Hopefully it's free and not random.
No, but it's free based on random choices, right? It's kind of like you've got a random set of choices and you have a free choice to choose from all of that randomness. Mm-hmm. And you're freely choosing from that, as opposed to there are a subset of choices here, or a selection of choices, and you're being influenced or manipulated based on your past experience to pick one of those to pick one of those things, as opposed to they're all just, that is what free will is. But after someone's picked it from those random things, I guess at that point it becomes an argument for determinism. It's almost like this self-proving thing, because it's like, okay, well at that point we couldn't decide what they were going to choose, we got that one wrong, but now they've chosen that one, it's one extra data point, which means that the next time we could be a bit closer to doing it. So it's almost like the argument continues just over and over and over and over and over again. But I mean, and I said I'm not wed to either.
No, me neither.
To either thing here.
Me neither,
nobody's a lot smarter people than us for the last 2,500 years.
But another version of this is a criminal, somebody who's done the terrible thing. We don't look back and say, "Oh, that was purely random." We don't go like, "Oh, that was just the universe got jumbled up, and that's why they just randomly murdered 18 people over like 5 years." That's not. No, we go like, that has consequences. There is a thing that we need to do now. We need to decide that this person has. This is not deterministic. This is free will. They've decided to be this kind of person. We need to stop them. So we act weirdly as if it's free will, even though if you rewind the tape a little bit further, you're like, oh, well, their father was molesting them, etc. Like all these terrible things happen right before there. We're not willing to say, okay, that's just determinism. We act as if it's free will. So I think that it's really difficult to have this conversation because we act schizophrenically. Half the time we act like everything's free will. Half the time we act as if it's absolutely deterministic. Like this is foreshadowed. This is written in the stars or whatever.
But maybe that's because, I mean, in that example that you gave, like almost all of that data is actually untrue. So like where you've heard these things of, pedophiles, it's because they were molested as children and stuff. That research has been done, and that's just not true.
I was just throwing it out there.
So yeah, so I'm saying there are obviously certain clusters like within things that you can trace certain things, and you say these things are correlated, but whether it was causality or not, we don't know. It's like
I was just throwing out an anecdote, not that specific example.
But there's a whole like I guess in this thing it's really a difficult thing to have, and it's also really difficult coming from the cognitive bias that I have from a big data perspective, because you're looking at it. But what I know that within any average is it hides a range. We know that, right? So it's like whenever you're seeing 70%, what you're actually, within that, when you look at it all in a graph, there's going to be some that's 90 and some that's 2%, and that sort of, there's going to be like all different things that are going to appear in that. And what you're seeing in that average is literally that, the average, the median of what you're seeing there. And I still think that this comes back down to like the way that we're taught of like, why do we seek this? And because we have this need of finding an answer, and that's why kind of I think that
for hallucinating tapioca pudding,
that sort of thing of like political ideologies and like why we side that, and rather than it be okay with imagining a system that we were taught to say we don't really know the answer to a lot of this stuff, like we don't even know whether the choices that you're making right now are determined based on your past experiences. We know that you're the collective sum of all your past experiences, but we have no idea whether you're making a choice right now, and that choice is sort of not your fault. you know, or whether that choice is entirely your fault, because we have a system that blames you for that choice, right? So then if we were to turn around and say, actually, that choice that 13-year-old kid, you know, is making at that point, that's not their fault, you know, that's then we need a totally different system of how like crime and punishment and how we deal with
that's even
that.
more reason why we need to get in front of companies like Google, because if they're driving people's sentiment in one direction or another, if you believe there's any free will in the universe at all, and it's just determinism by virtue of inputs, you know, like what's coming into my eyeballs and my ear holes, then you might say, well, you probably shouldn't be looking at ads for porn, because that's probably going to send you down a weird path.
Well, you don't want the porn industry to exist at all, you know, because of what that does. But then, you know, where do you even start to have these conversations with
right
people,
here,
you know? So it's
right here, right now, Richard. Come on.
But it's just such a crazy thing, because I know that there's obviously, you know, niches of people in terms of there's amazing philosophers and stuff out there, you know, and people that have studied this, and you know, they will obviously be able to talk about this from one angle, and then you've got, you know, academics that have studied, you know, sociology and anthropology and all this sort of side of it, and it's just like, how do all of these like combine and come together? And like, I think of one example in terms of like social media platforms have this opt-out, you know, in terms of like they're conduits, they're not publishers, right? And this fucked us psychologically as people, because now what you've got is a lot of people will quote stuff. I include my own mum in this, by the way.
Okay.
You know, she will quote stuff that she's heard, you know, on the internet, you know, on Instagram, but she gives that the same degree of respect that she would if she read it in a newspaper or if she saw it on a TV. But she doesn't realise that they're governed by different laws, literally governed by different laws, right? So what she read on Instagram or like Facebook they're a platform, they're not a publisher. They hide behind those laws, right? So whatever you read on Instagram or Facebook, they're not responsible for it whatsoever. It's the person that's posted it that's responsible. Whereas if you read it in a newspaper and that's wrong, they're getting fucking sued for that. You know?
Well, in the UK they are.
Yeah, and they're getting sued for it. If you see it on the TV and stuff and that's wrong, you know, it's like they're getting sued for that. It's just like you can't do that, right? It's a big thing. So,
although there has been one case, I think it was Fox News was sued for a very large amount of money. I forget the number now, but hundreds of millions or billions. For
the electoral thing and the ballot company, right?
Yeah, I can't remember all the details, but yes, something like that. Yeah. Richard, I hate to do this, but we need to switch. We need to switch content. We need to switch to mental health. We have to do this.
Actually, it's because
I have to switch.
I know that you were gonna, because you mentioned it earlier on and stuff. It's all connected.
It is, but I want to make sure we cover this, because this is first of all, it's very, very interesting. Second, it's super important. I think you're actually doing some really interesting research. And third, I think that if we continue down this path, we're never going to get there. And then you'd have to come back, and that would be a tragedy.
It'd be a tragedy for me to come back. Well,
I'm just
you know, you're not welcome.
I'm just being funny. Okay, so you decided to go and actually work for the government, which just blows my mind that you're like, yeah, that's what I want to go do. Can you please talk about that a little bit?
So yeah, this wasn't one of my best career choices, to be honest. So
this is after Publicis.
So yeah, I worked at Google, and then I went to a big job of a Publicis, which is I think the largest media group in the world, you know, I think they're responsible for something like 1 in every 2 advertising pounds or 1 in every 3 advertising pounds or something. And then after that, I kind of quit there again. Sort of, I had this sort of moral schizophrenia thing, and didn't really know what I was. You know, I thought I should be doing something more with the world than what my skills were. And then I had this whole, what are my skills? You know, and then sort of went down this whole philosophical and psychedelic path to sort of like try and work this out. And then somehow I ended up working for the largest government contractor in the UK. So they run all of like the contactless sort of system, and they have like the big education platform. They're involved in absolutely everything. They're called Capita, like a big sort of company. A lot of people don't know it exists, and they have tons and tons of government contracts. And they were setting up this sort of special division that was a consultancy division, and the whole pitch to me was actually it was a headhunter that reached out to me and said, I'm not going to tell you the name of this company because you're definitely not going to work there if I tell you it, because they get trashed in the paper all the time. They do really bad things in terms of they're involved in like the social welfare system and deciding like who gets payments and who doesn't get payments and all of this sort of side of it. TV licensing in the UK, which is something that I'm fundamentally against. You know, how you can still have a TV license. It's 2023. How you can, it's a law. So if you don't pay your TV license in the UK for like some channels, you can get prosecuted. You can go to prison.
You should. You're a bad person.
It's the wildest thing. It's like the wildest sort of like enforcement of propaganda, you know, in terms of like you have to have these channels.
It's very strange.
It's so wild, like it's crazy. Yeah. But like that's a crazy part of it. And they do all this stuff, right? So it was put to me, and I was thinking of maybe going into, you know, actually working for one of the parties, but then like I was just like, well, how do you pick between all these like morally bankrupt people out there? And then I somehow ended up at this company, like long story short, and the pitch to me was they have an incredible amount of data and you know what to do with that data, and you can do some real good stuff with that data. You can work, you know, with the Department of Education. One of the first things that I did when I went into that was brought across like some people from government that were working in government at the time, like incredibly smart people. That these people were, you know, academics from, you know, one person in particular, you know, really smart PhD person from Imperial, you know, was working in a really low paid job, or not low based on the medium, but low paid in terms of the private sector, you know, a low paid job sort of in government because she really wanted to make a difference. And she sort of like came and 3 times her salary, you know, and sort of doing this. And anyway, as it turned out, the timing wasn't ideal and we arrived at the pandemic in short. So I ended up sort of being in this sort of advisory consultancy position in the middle of the pandemic, where we were, you know, effectively trying to sell data in the sort of a very sort of shortened way of saying it to the UK government sort of at the time, and working with them. And it was at that point where I really realised it was a really difficult time for me, because I realised that I guess that the kind of the veil of Maya was sort of lifted up from my eyes, and I thought, well, these people running the country, they're not the smartest people in the room, you know, they're not even qualified in a lot of cases, and like they're there through nepotism, and they're making decisions, and they're making decisions in their own interest. And I obviously knew that it existed, but just not on the same scale. You know, I didn't really realize that these people genuinely don't know what they're doing, you know?
Yeah. So this is during the pandemic, and you found out at some point that people were being sent to work during the pandemic, right?
I mean, there was so many examples of like some crazy shit that happened in terms of there was, we had a thing in the UK where people were having to self-shield. So like if you had an underlying health condition, you were forced to basically stay indoors. And one of the things that sort of that came up during this is like, what about these people's mental health? You know, one person, you know, in the room, somebody went, oh, hold on a minute. You know, we have physical health and we have mental health, and they sort of work in tandem, both of these things. You know, you can't just look after one and not the other. But I guess the reason why a lot of people focus on physical health is we have more rational frameworks for governing physical health, right? In terms of like food, water, blah, 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 all this sort of thing. It's a lot more difficult for rational frameworks within mental health. And then somebody said we should really monitor these people's mental health. And at the time I suggested a few different ideas of what we should do, of which one of them was an app that we could potentially build, like peer-to-peer support for these people that were sort of self-shielding. And I was sort of outvoted on that by very many degrees, and they ended up like giving a contract to some sort of like crappy contractor, and they built call centers to call these people and ask them how they were doing. And of course, in a pandemic that was airborne, these call centers all got, you know, it's a famous thing, it was on the news and stuff in the UK, and these call centers got closed down because they had COVID outbreaks, right? And it was just, but there's just one example of, you know, I could go into like the furlough scheme that we had in the UK, which is about, you know, companies being able to kind of basically furlough their staff so they didn't have to pay them. Like these are like FTSE 150 companies, you know, these are companies that are incredibly profitable, and they're taking government loans. And and we are going to get to mental health here, by the way. And I know this is a big,
want that.
I know it's a big long tangent and stuff. On it,
I want that. I want that for you. Come on.
The problem with a lot of this stuff is like, it's a long story.
It is.
You know, and it's just like, people don't want the long story.
No, I want the long story, but I also want it before we run out of time.
they want the sound bites, you know, and it's just like people don't want to go.
No, I do want it.
The reason why the world looks like this is because it's all this history beforehand, you know, and it's just they're like, no, I don't want to believe that. Just tell me about the last week. You know? And it's like,
you got my attention. Come on.
So you've got like a lot of like crazy shit that sort of decisions that they made that were just the most like just some really bad stuff. And the furlough scheme was, you know, these massive companies. You had kind of, you know, a football club, a Premier League football club in the UK that took a government loan. You know, they're fucking owned by billionaires. Like it's fantasy league football for billionaires. It's what they do on a Sunday with their mates, you know, if they're drinking buddies, and they're taking loans. And there's a way in which, like, government, you know, they try and dehumanize language. So this idea of even using the term government, as in the government gives that loan. It's not government, it's people. And it's mainly working class and poor people that give that loan, because the people that are really earning the money, they've got fucking tax havens and they're not paying any tax anyway. So this is people that there's laws that if you don't pay your tax, they forcibly take that tax. Remember, this is what, you know, forcibly take it. If you
with swords or guns.
With swords and stuff, because they've written those laws in. They said, we cut everyone's head off 1,000 years ago, and now out of your paycheck, we're going to take money. And then they take that money and then they give it to their mates when they got into power. And that's what happened. And there's loads of crazy shit that hasn't come out about the pandemic yet, about contracts being awarded for PPE equipment to, you know, companies that were set up, and those companies were in some way related to politicians. There's so many of these stories that, like, if you find them and you go online and you look for them, they exist, right? And then it got to this point where I was just like, I don't want to do this. And it, like, you know, I was developing mental health problems sort of off the back of this, and was just like, no one's listening to me. Who's making decisions in the best interest for people here? Because it feels like they're making decisions in the best interest of companies. And who's making decisions in the best interest of the people? And then what started to happen is a lot of companies out there, every crisis creates an opportunity, you know, and then they started to go, we can just shift a load of our staff and we can blame it on the pandemic. We can just get rid of a load of old dead weight here and stuff. And companies started to do that, including Capita. They did that in a really, really bad way. There was like lots of companies that had tribunals sort of filed against them. And again, if you really look online and stuff about this, I'm really surprised there hasn't been documentaries and stuff that have been made about this. But like some of the laws got changed in the UK, you know, to protect these companies, you know, a bit beforehand. And just the worst form of capitalism, you know, in terms of we have all the power, the workers have fuck all, and let's just punish them all. And I saw really, really bad things happening during that time in terms of, you know, the people giving up jobs that they had 5 years security, you know, and in the UK, they now have this thing that basically until you've been at a job for 2 years, you have fucking no rights, you know, that you can just get fired immediately, you know, and you don't have to, there's no reason for that given. But once you've been there 2 years, it's a bit more difficult, you know, you have to go through a proper process and things. And I saw people giving up jobs for, you know, 5-6 years that they'd been and have all this security, start at this, you know, new company, which at the time was Capita, and then get fired after a week. You know, just like, hey, we made a bad decision. You're done. There's a month. Suck it up. By the way, you're in the middle of a pandemic. Enjoy finding the money to pay your mortgages, you know, during this. And all of this stuff was happening. And I just saw like a lot of my friends and people around me and people's just mental health just deteriorating, just like falling off a cliff. And then I tried to do something to look, what, you know, one of the things I advised was like looking at the 2008 financial crisis and looking at the impact that had on people's lives. There was one study that was done by a professor at Yale. I forget, his name escapes me now, but he tried to look at the impact of how many extra lives were lost as a result of the financial crisis. And it was a study that was done it was commissioned by the EU. And he come up with a massive figure, and he basically said, you know, within the sort of white paper that he published at the end of it, he said they limited the cause of death to a couple of different areas, And I believe that the reason they did that is because they didn't want to know the true extent of how many people actually died as a result of this. And what I'm saying, there was a really amazing book called A Body Keeps a Score that was all about this as well. It talks about the impact of stress on the body and how that can age you, and how the coping mechanisms of the lower social classes between the higher social classes, and how much longer the richer people and the poorer people sort of like live. So I kind of really saw a lot of this, and it really affected my mental health at the time. And I was sort of like, how can I help with this? Like this seems really unfair. And then I started to look at things like suicide rates that were just absolutely, actually during the pandemic, they weirdly went down. Temporarily went down because people were being locked inside, and these people felt, they didn't feel.
Well, they felt like there's probably a purpose, I would assume. Like there's a purpose of locking down, and they're with their, spouse for the first time probably in years. And they probably felt like this is something we're doing together temporarily. And then it all fell off a cliff.
Absolutely. And there's probably a whole variety, as we say, those deterministic data points. There's probably tons of them on there.
Well, I would say the one data point that I tracked that I thought was the most interesting was the rates of syphilis, which should have gone down tremendously because everyone's quarantining, but it went up. And I think the reason for it is people were, for the very first time in a very long time, quarantining with their significant other they probably had not had a relationship with a long time since they were with the last girl or whatever. And so we actually saw a massive uptick in new disease, in syphilis in particular.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. But yeah, that makes sense. There was also a massive uprise in domestic violence, because people were being locked inside. They didn't have the escape routes of their partners and things on there. So there was really horrific stuff that happened. And again, we could tumble down a whole rabbit hole about like COVID. So let's not do that. Let's just put a pin in that and sort of why was the world shut down, all that sort of stuff. But one statistic that just kind of really like rings in my head from it is since the very first reported COVID case in December 2019 to the present day, globally there's a figure that a lot of people kind of agree on of the amount of lives that were lost as a direct result of COVID. And it's this figure of about 6.7 million. You hear it sort of quite a lot, and it seems a bit of a universal type figure that people sort of say now. During that same 3.5 year period, it's predicted that there was about 28 million people. So that's 6.7 versus 28 million people that lost their life as the result of a mental health condition. That was either direct suicide or associated to that, i.e. some overdose or addiction and stuff that was a direct result of that. 28 million versus 6.7 million. And you think we shut the whole world down because of COVID, and no one's even talking about this other side of it. Mental health conditions account for about 15% of the global burden of disease. They get less than 0.5% of global healthcare budgets.
0.5.
They get less than 0.5, yet they account for 15% of global burden of disease. By the year 2030, depression is on track to be the leading cause of mortality globally. No one seems to be talking about that. It's not like on the news. There's not like big sort of charities and stuff that are out there and everyone's screaming about depression. I know there's more awareness. I get it. There's more awareness, but that awareness is quite simply just not translating into more investment in healthcare budgets. There's a whole variety of factors on this, but it's mainly one of the big reasons of this is mental health conditions disproportionately affect the working class and the lower classes as opposed to the higher classes. Or the higher socioeconomic groups, and that's mainly because the coping mechanisms, they have access to really good coping mechanisms. They have access to doctors. If they want to see a therapist, they just fucking go and see a therapist. If they need a break from their job, they just go on holiday. If they're getting sad syndrome because they don't have enough sunshine, they just book a flight and they go to the Bahamas, right? And then people talk about, look at what happens with the welfare system, and these people get they get their welfare and then they spend it on drugs and alcohol. It's like, because those people are working in factories. The reason why when you go to a supermarket and you can get food and it's on the shelves is because some people went to a factory and they stacked it, or some people stacked it on themselves, and some people like did all of that. Like in that whole distribution system, there's a whole bunch of working class and lower class people that make all of that exist. And you know, to get all the way back to the sort of Marx, you know, on it, separating the worker from the means of production and stuff. If you have a go like Simone Weil did and sort of like work in one of these factories, what you can't do in that factory is think. You know, you need to meet the quota. Look at Amazon and stuff on this, right? It's all about like fast. You have to meet the quota, and if you don't meet the quota, you get fired from it. It's like, it's really stressful, and these people earn fuck all money, and they don't have enough money for food and housing, and we're in this huge cost of living crisis. And then what do they turn to? And they go, "What's my coping mechanism here?" And they're like, "I'm going to turn to like maybe some recreational drugs, and I'm going to turn to some alcohol, right?" And it's understandable on a deterministic value.
So you went and decided to start interviewing psychiatrists, psychologists. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I kind of saw this, and I said I went through my own sort of like, you know, mental health struggles and stuff on this. I sort of actually found myself in rehab, but like I sort of had like a sort of early midlife crisis, sort of like a complete sort of breakdown of just like what was going on. And it was kind of one of these points where, I mean, you now have the context of back earlier on in the conversation when I was saying about sometimes we just don't know the answers, and our education system teaches us that there's an answer for everything because that's what you get marked on. And when I started to, you know, look at or get exposed to sort of large scale government type decisions, I really looked and I went, "Whoa, there's no right answer here." You know, sometimes the answer is like, it's just wrong and it's slightly less wrong. You know, it's just like, there's no good answer here. And that, to someone that's been brought up in that sort of, you know, in that education system of like that idealistic of, oh, there's an answer for everything, it was really difficult. I guess when you're brought up in a different social bracket and you're taught that we're different and we're special, I guess it's much easier to be more sociopathic and have less empathy at that point and just go, "Oh, well, let's make this decision because who gives a fuck? It doesn't affect us anyway." You know, it's like we've currently got a prime minister of the UK, and the biggest cost of living crisis that we've had in a long time is a fucking billionaire. Like you can make it up, you can put it in a movie script, right? And it's just because he's like such a sociopath that he's able to make decisions on the basis of, I don't care, they're just statistics to us. So I kind of went like, how can I help? Like, you know, what can I do here? Is there any way of taking what I learned within the sort of big data and advertising industry and all of the deterministic stuff that we were talking about and going, can I help? Like, are people aware of this? You know, what if people were aware of the amount of information that Facebook had on them? What could they do with it? You know, like there's 1,440 minutes in every single day. And I wonder if everyone knows what they do with those 1,440 minutes. I wonder if they looked across the course of a week and they saw what they did with their minutes. I wonder if they would go, fuck, I really need to change my life and make better decisions. You know, now imagine that across a month or 6 months or a year. I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt that if they went, this is your life, it's right there, it's just a series of choices and this is what you're doing, I think people would make better decisions. And I think if people knew the impact that, you know, digital technology and social media was having on their lives, I think that they might think more about using it. You know?
So when you talk to these psychologists and psychiatrists, what was their process?
So what was really sort of fascinating...
You talked to 100 of them.
I talked to like, it's probably way more than that now,
okay.
You know, like a lot of them. And what was sort of fascinating about it was they all knew the problem. You know, like they weren't, it wasn't like you had to extract it out of them. You know, it was like they knew the problem. Like quite simply, they just don't have enough data in which to make decisions from. It just doesn't exist. Like there's no X-ray machine that exists for mental health. You know, there's no MRI for mental health.
But you were telling me at one point, it's quite a while back, so I might get the statistic wrong, but something like 50% or whatever, very, very high percentage was misdiagnosed on the first visit.
So I think the statistic's actually around 70%.
Wow.
So I think it's the sort of generally sort of quoted statistic is that
it's worse than roll of the dice.
So it's a bit different from that because like roll of the dice of like, yeah, roll of the dice are obviously 1 in 6, like a coin flip, like 1 in 2. But mental health conditions, like part of the problem with it is it's so subjective, even our understanding of it. So you can get really deep on this. They have something called the ICD-11 and the DSM-5 that are frameworks for understanding what are mental health conditions. So now I'm not going to knock those frameworks, right? They've obviously been, there's a lot of studies that have gone into it.
Why not? I mean, it seems like they're not doing their job.
They're not, but I think that there's enough problems outside of those frameworks, even if we give those frameworks the benefit of saying, whatever you classify, whatever your classification of generalized anxiety disorder or depression, whatever that is, let's say that, let's just, for the benefit of this conversation, let's just say that's true. Now, the real problem is how they understand whether you fall into that bracket or the more pressing problem is how they understand whether you fall into that bracket. Now, what's currently happening is, and again, I'm going to sort of do this in a basic level. There's slightly more nuance to it than this and stuff, but this is roughly it, as people understand. You start feeling shitty, or, you start feeling like I've got a problem with my mental health, and you've got a couple of choices there, you've got quite a lot of choices, but I'm saying if you decide to seek help, once you've decided on that, you can either go, if you live in a country where there's a national healthcare service or you've got some sort of insurance, you can go to some sort of doctor and you can say, this is how I'm feeling, and they will refer you on to a specialist. Or you can just pay for it privately and you can just go and find a specialist. Now, the first point of being is that mental health conditions are very specialized. There's a range of them, in terms of depression is very different to trauma. In terms of anxiety to OCD, to sociopath, there's lots of different ones, and they're specialists in each of those areas. So if you recognize you have a problem, but you don't know what your problem is, you sort of just have to pick one, right? So then you go to one and then you sit down, and then what happens, think about it, right? So you've seen it in movies, you've seen it in TV programs and stuff, and you sit down, psychiatrist sits there with you, and then they ask you a bunch of questions, and you then answer those questions. And at the end of that, what happens mostly is they sign off some SSRIs, antidepressants.
Yes.
And they sign these off and they go, take these and you're going to feel a shit ton better, right?
Yes. So before we go too much further, a huge amount of the people working on the DSM-5 as part of the DSM-5 committee are directly tied to pharma. So that makes a lot of sense why they suddenly would find a reason to give you some SSRIs.
100%, right? So we've seen this before. We've seen this not before, we've seen it now. The Sackler family and the oxycodone crisis, I think there's a statistic that something like 96% of heroin addicts start with an addiction to a prescription medication, right? No one wants to...
So I pulled up the stat. 69% of the DSM-5 task force members have ties to pharma. Okay, so that's pretty damning right there. Like, if you're trying to say, is there a holistic way to make this person better that doesn't involve very serious psychoactive drugs, maybe you don't look at DSM-5.
And so, I was even for the benefit of this saying that, let's just imagine that DSM-5 is
let's
right.
Imagine.
Let's imagine it's right. There's still so many problems
I don't think that's
from there.
I don't think that's a good assumption, but all right, let's go ahead.
The other side of it is saying that, I know it's wrong. I was just saying, there's so many other pressing, problems before we get to changing the classification system of it. The reality of it is the entire system is wrong, right? But people don't want to know this, right? People don't want to know the reality of, hey, you're feeling depressed? Cool. It probably just means you're a good person. It probably just means that you've got some level of empathy, that you read the news and you've had conversations and you talk to people, because we're in the middle of this crazy cost of living crisis. There's a statistic that the 80 richest people in the world have the same combined wealth than the poorest 4 billion. That's a real statistic. These are real things that are happening in the world, and it's just that's a depressing thing. You're supposed to feel depressed at that point. These people that jump around, I just choose to be positive all the time. It's you're choosing to be delusional. That's a mental health condition. You're delusional. So it's just you're supposed to have a full emotional spectrum. Sometimes you're going to feel anxious because the fucking world's an anxious place. There's loads of sometimes you're going to feel depressed. No one wants to tell you that. What they want to tell you is you should be really happy. If you're not happy and you're not jazz hands all the time, you need some SSRIs. So that's just not fucking true. It's sometimes you need to cry. Sometimes you need to get angry, but just try not to hit anyone, don't hurt anyone when you're angry, you know, go to a boxing class or some shit like that, you know. It's
hurt
like,
them.
Yeah, it's just like, you know, like just like, don't do that, right? But
don't hurt people in boxing class.
But what's happening now is we've got this entire generation of people that are being sold these fucking lies of you need to be happy all the time. You're seeing these statistics, like here's a name that no one knows, Frances Haugen. I'm sorry if I pronounce your surname wrong, by the way. No one knows who that is, right? Yeah. She was a whistleblower that worked at Facebook. I would argue that if you looked at why Facebook rolled out all of their metaverse and their conspiracy theory time, by the way,
sure.
But like, just look at it. Like, look how quickly they did that. Look at that weird video that Mark Zuckerberg put online, and like, why did it all happen so quickly and stuff? And then look at what was happening, like just in the immediate time, just a few days or weeks before that. Someone called Frances Haugen come out and she whistle blew and she put a report online about Instagram, and part of that report said there is a direct correlation between the propensity to self-harm in 11 to 17-year-old girls and the amount of time they're spending on Instagram. We know that people that are spending time on Instagram, it's fucking causing problems, and like people are still on it and no one knows her name anymore. And no one's talking about this. You know, doctors and governments, you know, like we have, you know, people are saying you can't take psilocybin for the treatment of depression because that is a section 1 or a class 1 drug. It has no therapeutic purposes whatsoever. Ask the psychology industry, right? They know this is a lie. It's been a lie since it was like since the 70s, and like there's enough evidence on this now, right? So people that are hiding behind this, you know, and sort of saying, oh, well, it's a law. I think we discussed what a law is earlier on in this sort of program. It's just someone's preference, right? So it's like, get to speed with this, first of all. We've now got this sort of generation of people that are being sold these lies, that are being sold this, you should feel happy all the time. You should have an answer for life. And they don't have that. And they don't feel happy all the time because they're anxious and they're depressed and they're turning to self-harm. This is what's happening with young girls now. And they're being taught in schools that there's an answer to everything. There's a right answer to everything. And we're teaching you the answer. And the reality is we don't fucking know. There's not. We don't know how human existence happened. We can't really explain to you in any way that giant planet of fire that's in the sky, you know, that like, we really understand. We can't do that, right? And it's just, there's just a lot of chaos that's out there, and it's okay. And what's happened is people have sold us these lies, and because they've sold us these lies about being happy and, you know, that, you know, we should have this amazing fulfillment in life, and that, you know, we should be living these really amazing, happy Kardashian sort of lifestyles and stuff. And it's just like, break the Kardashians' life down, you know? It's just like, they're fucking deeply unhappy people, you know? It's just like, it's madness. But that's what's happening. And the psychology industry, it's like, it's an entire industry that is wrong. And unfortunately, people are focusing on it, you know? And they're saying that's the best answer. Like, Sigmund Freud, do you know how much coke that guy did? Like, it's just like, you know, there's lots of reports and stuff on this. Like, the guy wrote a book about cutting women's clitorises off. Mm-hmm. And people still talk about psychoanalysis. You know, I'm not saying that, like, you know, good people can't have bad ideas and you can't have good ideas and bad ideas, but I'm just saying it needs to be considered within context, right? And that's what the industry is doing right now. And where I'm coming at it is a case of saying, from what I learned in my advertising industry, I know that, like, people are nuanced, but at the same time, people are creatures of habit, and you'll make a lot of choices the same.
So walk me through what happens. I walk in, I say, hey, doc, I'm feeling bad about X. How does it go from that beginning conversation to the end of that meeting, maybe second, third, fourth meeting, where I'm now SSRIs, despite the fact I probably don't need them, or I'm told I'm afraid of elevators, even though I don't give a shit about elevators? Like, how is it swung so far away from whatever original problem I have? Like, how does that work?
So it's not necessarily, I guess the point, I'll explain that, but one of the things I'd like to say is that, like, it's not necessarily that when you take SSRIs, you don't need them, because they will make you feel better, right? But it's in the same way as, like, if you've ever taken MDMA, like, it fucking feels amazing, you know? It's like, you know, you take it and, like, if you just want to feel happy all the time, it's just like, just take drugs all the time. It's like, you're telling me that, like, you know, heroin addicts and people that are, like, living in the street that are waking up.
To be clear, the Arsenic Show does not advocate taking drugs all the time.
I'm not saying that, but, like, I was
Not
being
just specific ones.
I was being slightly facetious there, but like, as effectively what I was saying is that like, you think that these drug addicts that are in the street, you know, that are living under shelters, that are living, you know, under bridges, and you know, waking up in their own piss and, you know, sick and stuff. You think that they're doing that because the drugs they take aren't fucking wicked, you know. The drugs they take are awesome, you know. It's just like it feels amazing. The question is like, is that what we want for our life? You know, do you constantly just want like all of that serotonin like pumping through your body, like, and all that dopamine all the time? It's like, no. It's just like, if you had that all the time, you'd never get anything done. Like, it's just like, I believe, which is why this free will sort of side of it coming back, I believe there's something inside of us that wants to have some sort of greater impact on the world. Like, I believe that like inherently we want to make the world a better place, and we want to sort of serve people. And I think there's something in that. So pumping us full of drugs that either numb our experience or just pump us full of serotonin and dopamine that make us feel better when actually we don't feel better, I don't think that's a good thing. And when you're going there with a psychologist, like, they're having to do a lot in that one moment. So let's run through like the criteria that they're judging you on at that moment, right? Effectively, they're asking you a bunch of questions. You've probably done these online, or you've seen a bunch of them. Like, do you have depression? Like, I mean, fucking Apple just integrated it into the new iOS, like a depression questionnaire. Answer these questions, and at the end of it, we'll tell you if you've got depression. It's just like, how's that helping? Who's it help at that point? Oh, I've just done this questionnaire and it says I'm fucked. Oh, brilliant. Do you feel better from that? Like,
No.
like, it's just like, what a mental thing for like, I mean, who made that decision at Apple? You know, what a crazy thing. And it's just like, that's what's happening, right? And one, people are not that self-aware. Two, like, people, when they're answering those questions and stuff, they've put in an awful lot. Think of exams, you know, people get shit wrong, you know, they get nervous when they're answering, don't really know themselves and stuff. Like, imagine saying like, how do you feel right now? You don't know that. No one knows how they feel right now. Like, it's much easier looking back in time. Like, like, when was the last time you felt angry? You know, and it's like, oh, that person pissed me off, and it's just like, it's easier to do it like that. So, a lot of the time, like, sometimes it's the way that data is captured that is the problem. But like, what a psychiatrist, when you sit down with them, is roughly doing is they're judging you across a number of different categories. So, one is they're looking at cognition. So, cognition is what you think. So, what you think you feel. That's very different from what you feel. And there's an important distinction to be made there.
Yeah, I think this is worth spending just a little minute on. One of the things I thought was most interesting that you were talking about is the question they ask, not necessarily in the intake, but the question that they ask afterwards. They basically ask, oh, how you feeling today? Or, you know, did you have a good day or whatever? Like, what's the problem with that?
So it's the point of, right, so let's say you're sat with a psychiatrist right now. You've got something called environmental deterministic bias. So the very fact that you're sat with that psychiatrist and you're in that room means that you've got a bias. You know, you're now like, oh, I've got a problem because I'm sat with a psychiatrist and this appointment has been in my diary all week and I've traveled here to do this. And now all these different feelings are sort of coming up inside of you. You're remembering all of this bad shit that's happening in your head. And they're not necessarily your real thoughts. You know, there's not the stuff that's happening all the time. It's just because that environment is bringing out all of that shit inside you, right? So that's part of the problem. And then the psychiatrist will often sort of say, like, how are you feeling? And you think about what a strange question is that, you know, and it's just kind of like, how am I feeling in that moment?
Yeah, I just got cut off in traffic. I'm pissed.
And you're like, okay, I'm really pissed off. So now you spend, or like, you know, let's say a psychologist actually would be better, you know, more like a regular therapist that someone goes to on a day-to-day basis would be better than saying a psychiatrist, which sort of tends to come at the top, and then you know, you'd have a therapist sort of after that. But now you're sat with your therapist, and your therapist is getting paid per hour. Right? So let's remember that, right? That your therapist is getting paid per hour. They're not getting paid on outcome here, right? So and I'm not saying that people don't go into therapy for good purposes. I'm just saying the model, your business model is you get paid per hour, right? So the more that person talks, sort of the less you have to do, right? Because like they would argue the more data we're capturing and that we're analyzing that data, but I'll run through like why that's a sort of silly way of doing it. So now you say, right, I'm really pissed off about this. And then they say, tell us what just happened. And then you say, well, this guy just cut me off in traffic, as you just said. And then, you know, and then the therapist is like, well, you know, why did that annoy you? You know, tell me. And then you go through this whole thing and then you get all of this out and you talk about it for 45 minutes, and they're going to like interject with like little questions and stuff. And at the end of it, you vented like a lot, and then you high five your therapist and you go, thanks for that. And then you sort of walk out, and 20 minutes later, you then start to be really sad again, and you're really depressed, and you're like, oh, fucking hell. I don't think it was related to that. That guy cutting me
Just
off.
wasted 45 minutes.
And I just wasted the 45 minutes, and I just paid someone $200 for that. And you're like, well, what would I have done ordinarily if that guy didn't, that person, didn't cut me up in traffic? Like, I might have just walked it off or text one of my friends or whatever, or I'd calm down and stuff. All the psychoanalysts out there are going to go, well, actually, it's about why did that make you angry, and we should be dealing with that. There's, again, different branches of therapy have different solutions to this, and there's lots of different ways of doing different, not solutions. I want to take that question back. Different ways of trying to address your problem. Not to say that any of them are solutions, but just different ways of trying to address it. What that therapist really should be asking you, or what they really should be trying to understand, is when was the last time that you felt the way that you felt that prompted you to want to get help
in the first place?
Because that's very different. Because like someone cuts you up in traffic and you don't immediately go, fuck, I'm angry, I need to see a psychiatrist. But something triggered you to go and see a therapist, or somebody said you need some help, and it was like, what's that feeling, right? And they need to get to that point, like, what's that feeling? So what they're trying to do in that thing is observe a lot of different things about you. They're asking you questions, and based on the answers that you give and the things they're observing, they're effectively trying to run through this massive diagnostic framework. We referred to it earlier. And there's all these different things, and they're trying to narrow it down and sort of go, what's the answer here? Because each one of those mental health conditions will have a certain amount of certain treatment, recommended treatment attached to it, and then they can give you that. But as we know, the majority of them, they'll just turn around and say, well, you can take SSRI, so that'll make you feel better. And it's like, we know that. We know if you give people drugs, like if you give them serotonin and dopamine and stuff, it makes them feel better. It's like, go to any festival. It's like there's a whole bunch of people feeling really happy there. It's just like... Amazingly happy, right? And it's just like... So they're in this situation now where they're monitoring you across a number of things. Cognition, like being one of them, so what you think. And that's different from, again, how you feel. It's what you think you feel. The other one is your physiology, in terms of what's happening, in terms of like, are you sweating? Are your pupils dilating? Are you twitching? Are you nervous? Are you going red? Like, what's happening? Neurology would be another one, but they can't get that. That's your brain activity. But
they can in small studies.
Yeah, in small studies, but they're not putting an EEG on your head and stuff like when you're in, sat in therapy and stuff, sure. Are you, right? You would have another side of it, which is your behavior. So, like, what did you do to that day? Your step count.
Did you leave your house at all?
Yeah. How much sleep are you getting? Where are you going for food? Are you making your own meals? What do you do for a job?
Did you spend 5 hours at the bar?
How much sunlight are you getting? Blah, blah, blah. How much time are you spending in nature versus the city? How much time are you spending on Instagram? Blah, blah. Anything to do with your behavior. And then there would probably be a fifth category, which is environment. So external factors in terms of what's going on in the news or what's the weather, that could probably be wrapped into behavior, and then you've got these sort of 4 buckets. And they're trying to judge all of those, which is why the degree of subjectivity of what they're doing, and when I spoke to a lot of them, they know it. They're like, it's really tough, because they're asking you a question. And when they're asking you a question, they don't even know if you're telling the truth. You don't even know if you're telling the truth. Like sometimes you're just free flowing and you're just saying shit and you're like, oh, I was sort of half remembering a conversation I had there, and I read this book once and I saw this documentary. And
the weather sucked that one day.
Yeah, and the weather sucked that one day, and you're piecing stuff together, and then you're like, oh, my girlfriend, she's a bitch and it was all her fault. And you're like, oh, it was probably my fault as well, and it was probably a bit to do with that and that. And it's all like, as we say, there's lots of different things here. And they're having to take all that information with their little notepad and pen, and as you're saying it, the answer tends to be, at the end of it, you should take some antidepressants,
It's almost a foregone conclusion.
Or it's like, okay, what else have they got? You should do some meditation, download Calm, do some mindfulness. It's like, what else have they, what are
the tools they have?
Yeah, what other tools have they got? And with such limited data, it's like they need more data, but then that's not where they're trained, right? And then you'll have the psychoanalysts, that will go, okay, so rather than just need 12 sessions, like a CBT sort of therapist that's teaching you certain behaviors, and CBT is all about when you're feeling this, feeling that you don't want to feel, here's some things that you can do, like some coping mechanisms of that. Psychoanalysts would turn around and say, why do you feel that thing in the first place? So when that event happens, why does that trigger that? And then they'll go, let's spend 3 years in therapy going through all of these semi-rational frameworks, this Freudian life thing, and basically piecing a deterministic graph together of, oh, well, this is it. And then all they're trying to do is get you to the point where you go, that's an answer. Remember, because what we were talking about earlier, when you're in school, you're taught there's a right and wrong answer. So actually all you're looking for in amongst all of your depression and is you're just looking for an answer for it, because that's the thing. And then they say something that pieces it together. Oh, your dad did this, your mum did this, you abused as that. And then you're like, whoa, it all makes sense to me now. You know, like that's the reason why I feel like this. Thanks very much. And then you go away and then that works for 3 months and then you go straight back into it. Because it's not that simple, right? It's not, there's not one answer for this. It's not because you weren't hugged enough as a 4-year-old, you know, it's just like that. That's just not it. So what's the solution? What do we do about this? So first off, there isn't a solution. So like, it's important to recognize that it's just like, there's, like we were saying, like with most of the stuff that's out there, there's no right answer. There's some frameworks that we've got that sort of like you know, political ideologies on how to govern societies. There's some that sort of work, but they have massive drawbacks to them, and there's some that work in different ways and stuff, but none of them are right. So don't define yourself by that right thing, because that's what we were taught in school, right? So then what happens is when people have found something that's right and they go, right, capitalism, this one seems right, they then attach all of their identity to that thing, and then they start to defend it rather than actually trying to find, you know, rather than going, this works for now, but can we try and work on the flaws in it, because it's got some flaws, and maybe we bring in elements of socialism and this and we start to
careful there, you communist.
But, I mean, the Communist Manifesto actually is a beautiful read. You know, it's like it's more the implementation of the Communist Manifesto that's the problem.
Talking about taking people's power away.
Yeah, but
anyway.
Yeah. So this is the thing with it. There's no right answer to this. I'm just saying that what we're trying to do is say there are patterns in people's behavior, and we know this because we saw it in the advertising industry, or we see it. That's how Google makes all its money, right? It's just like they put you into an audience list.
So what does this actually look like? So how do I leverage this newfound knowledge?
So that's a good question. So one is, first of all, you have to collect that knowledge. And there's a beautiful thing in neuroscience where like awareness can often be the answer. You know, so just like by you saying, I feel really anxious, you know, if someone was able to give you an answer, you know, like we said of like on the days that you sleep less than 6 hours, you're 50% more likely to feel anxious. In a weird way, that can relieve your anxiety, or certainly it can relieve a lot of your anxiety because you've got a rational reason for it. You're like, oh, well, I did sleep less than 6 hours last night. And it's not some sort of like thing that I don't know. It's not because I wasn't hugged enough as a 3-year-old, or like mistakes that I made in life, or things that I did wrong to an ex-girlfriend. It's just because I didn't have a good night's sleep, you know. Like some of it is easy, and some of it will be like it is, you know, is more nuanced than that, you know. Some of it you will need therapy. There is certain things that you'll have to work through. Obviously, I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but I'm saying just by giving people more self-awareness is kind of a really big thing, like on an individual basis. So I'm saying if you know, most people that have mental health conditions go without treatment. So I think that's an important thing to sort of make. Like most people are just suffering. That's it. They don't have anything, right? And they're trying to figure it out themselves. And a lot of these people are turning to drugs and alcohol. But if we can give them like, hey, here's what you are, you know, like here's your life. Like here's what you did with the last 4,400 minutes. And by the way, here's some statistical analysis on that. And that statistical analysis might just be, imagine just somebody saying to you like, hey, on the days that you spend less than 3 hours outside, you're 50% more likely to feel depressed. Like we don't know if that's true, but we might be able to know if that's true, right?
That sounds like something that is knowable. One other thing you were telling me about this quite a while back, but I think it's useful. If you took one suicidal person and you introduce them to another person who has similar suicide ideology or whatever, they are less likely to commit suicide, not more likely.
Yeah.
So how do you leverage that knowledge?
So again, it's a change in behavior. So, people often when they're in the most desperate sort of thing is they internalize that.
I meant to say ideation.
Yeah.
But,
And they sort of internalize that, and they start to feel really alone, and they start to feel, shame, and they don't want to, they don't want to reach out for help. That's one of the barriers for people reaching out for help. Whereas that is one of those things, if you put two people with an eating disorder together, they're actually less likely to continue that eating disorder in a sort of weird, statistical way. Two suicidal people together, they're less likely to commit suicide and stuff in that thing because they feel less alone, and it's a change in behavior, and they can talk about it and they relate to someone. This is how group-based psychotherapy, which is one of the most proven forms of therapy, that's how this works. So if you think of like the Alcoholics Anonymous programs, and where people sit in a circle because they know that those people are their peers, they've all been through this before. I must say here, like as a caveat, like I'm not a trained psychologist or a psychiatrist. I'm a researcher, and this is just a whole variety of different research and stuff that I've done, and this is what's come out the back of that research. And I'm combining my statistical understanding of how audience lists are built within the advertising industry. And then I'm saying this works because these companies spend billions of pounds. Procter & Gamble spends over $4 billion every single year on advertising. And they spend that because they know it works.
Well, and Google makes well over $100 billion a year. Obviously it works.
Absolutely. Like it works.
People would not put that much money into their systems.
They find data points on you. They put it into audience lists. They sell you ads. You click on those ads and you buy products off the back of it. They know that works. It's a system. Like every time you've seen an ad on TV, or you've heard a jingle, or you've seen some sort of celebrity, like wearing a certain bag or a hat or something like that, that celebrity is being paid a shit ton of money because that brand is getting more money in return. Because by you seeing that celebrity on there, you're buying that bag. I'm saying we know this data works in this industry. I'm saying let's apply this. All I'm saying is let's apply it to the mental health industry. Let's just say the same level of data. Let's just bring that in, and let's, rather than that psychiatrist or that psychologist at the beginning of that session start to ask you a bunch of questions and subjectively be trying to judge it like there's some sort of poker player. Let's just get them to say, what do we know about you? Like,
well, but you also have compliance issues. So they say, well, let's say you're a pedophile or something, like you shouldn't go near schools or something. And then you look at the map of them going to schools. You're like, what's this whole thing about you hanging out next to a school for like 3 hours that one day? You're like, or like you're supposed to leave your house. You like, just don't be at home 24/7 for days on end. It's like, I left. And you look at the map, you're like, you didn't though. You're in your house the whole time. Or like don't go near bars. It's just, you have a problem, whatever. It's like, oh yeah, I didn't go to the bar. Well, except for this, like 5 to 6 hours you were here at this bar this one day, and then the next day, and then the next day, or whatever. Like, you spend a lot of time at a bar for not being at a bar at all. Like, oh yeah, well that was XYZ reasons. You can get to that kind of compliance much, much faster if you actually have real data, as opposed to self-reporting. Like, no, I'm good. I didn't go to the school. I didn't, I was outdoors like 3 days this last week or whatever. I left my house for sure. I definitely didn't go to the bar. I don't drink anymore. You're like, but these are provably not true. I'm looking at the map. Like, clearly you didn't do what you just said you did. I mean, without that, as you said, they have to be poker players. They have to go like, but did you really do this bad thing? Because you're the kind of person who might say this thing and do this other thing.
And it's exactly that. But they're just not taught that, right? The entire psychology industry works on inefficiency. They get paid on inefficiency. They're getting paid per hour. So it's just like, if somebody is in therapy for a year, they earn more money. So it's a weird thing that they're not incentivized for you to get better. There's no incentive. Like, what's the incentive? Like, if you go to therapy and then they go, oh, like, by the way, can you share all this data with me? And then you go, yeah. And then they share it all. And then they go, well, look, I'll come back to you. Let me analyze all this data and I'll come back to you. And then they come back to you and they go, here's everything that I've learned. Here's a report about you. Like, have a read of it and see what you think. And then someone reads the report and they go, fucking hell, this is great. Like, I'm just like, I didn't realize all this stuff about me. Like, I'm going to try and do this. Thanks a lot, doc. And then they give them a high five, and then they're like, oh, fuck, that was just 2 hours. Now, I'm not saying that they're doing that, right? I'm not saying that like psychologists are going, I don't want my patients to get happy, you know, to get better, because it's like, I'm going to need more clients. But that's like, it's like, that is what the industry is, right? And it just...
Okay, but are you saying that that's not happening?
I'm not saying it's happening,
okay.
But I'm just saying that that's the industry, right? And it's just, that's what it's not paid on outcomes, right? They're paid per hour. So it's just like, think of when you go there, you talk to them, and often like, how many fucking answers do they give you? Or how many times do they just go, well, I think you'd already know the answer to this question. And you're like, I don't fucking know the answer. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be in therapy. I'm not spending $200 an hour I'm coming here because there's something inside of me that I don't know, and I'm hoping that you've got the answer, and they don't. And this is the lie that has sort of been told. Like, they can sort of help on very like small niche sort of cases, but they just don't have enough data. And we have the tools to be able to give them this data, but they wouldn't even know how to use it. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is, even if we gave them the data and we said, here's all the data on the person, here's this person's life. And a lot of people like are scared by this, you know, of like, oh, well, I don't want my therapist to, you know, to have all of this thing. Your therapist's trying to fucking help you. It's like, you're in therapy because you want help. The people that you don't want to have it is all of the corporate companies, the for-profit companies. You don't want them to have it because they're going to sell it for profit.
Yeah, I always say there's 3 groups of people you should definitely never hide anything from. Your therapist, because otherwise you're not going to get better. Your legal staff, otherwise they're going to make terrible legal decisions on your behalf. And your security expert, because otherwise you're just going to end up with absolutely terrible security and you're going to get hacked for sure.
Interestingly, you didn't include like your wife or, you know, your family. Or
I mean, you should tell your wife the thing that she needs to know she's beautiful and that you love her. And that's the important parts. Well, if you intentionally lie, that's going to end you up in all kinds of catastrophes in all kinds of professions and all kinds of situations. But those in particular, those 3 are really catastrophic. They will do the acts, the total opposite of what you intend. You're like, oh, I don't want to tell my lawyer because I don't think my lawyer will look at me right. Well, if your lawyer doesn't know you're actually doing these 5 of the like shady businesses, he cannot protect you and you will go to jail. Your psychologist can't help you and you'll die. You'll actually kill yourself. And that's a pretty serious consequence. And in my world, you'll get very badly hacked and your information will be all over the internet. Yeah. So I think these are all the unintended consequences of lying, or of not necessarily lying in the truly malicious sense, but I think more in the sense you're talking about. Like, I got cut off in traffic. It's like, well, like, I'm so mad because I got cut in traffic. You're not lying. That's not a lie. It's true, but it's not the right kind of truth. It's the kind of truth that's leading you down a false impression of this person. And so you need to ask the right questions to get to the real answers. And that's what I think is missing from the DSM-5 and the current status.
With the DSM-5 and, to go on to that, it's a case of the degree of subjectivity within that doesn't need to exist now because there's so much data that's out there. And it's just, these companies are collecting it. Like, these companies, they know it. That's the thing. They know, like Spotify can understand from someone's music habits whether they've got depression or not. They're not going to tell you that. You know, they're not going to publicly release it and say, yeah, we know this, because people will be scared as fuck about it. Like, Facebook can understand through the way that people are interacting on their platform whether relationships are going to end and marriages are going to end before the people. And then some people start to go, why am I being served dating ads right now? Like, I know people that this has happened, right? They've started to have problems in their relationship and they've started to get dating ads. And you're like, this is what these companies are. There's no morals in these companies. A company doesn't have any morals because a company doesn't exist. It's just a piece of paper. It's just somebody wrote it down on a piece of paper. And then you've got people that are working inside of them that are incredibly well incentivized with all these cognitive bias, and then they're filled with all of these things of, yeah, but think of all of the good that social media does in the world. Like suicide rates are spiking. Mental health conditions are spiking. By the year 2030, depression is going to be the leading cause of mortality in the world. It's like, what's changed in the world? You know, why has this started to happen? And it's like, one of the big fundamental changes that we've had about our society is that social media has happened. Social media has happened into it. And it's like the answer is now really nuanced, because it's not to say, like I heard this psychiatrist talking about it the other day, and they were saying, let's say, a teenager is self-harming because they're on, because of social media. But the reason why they're self-harming when they're on social media, or one of the contributing factors, might be because they feel left out. They're not as popular. They're not the popular sort of person that's on it. So now if you remove them from social media, they become less popular because now they're not on it. So they're alienated even more from it, which actually might perpetuate their sort of condition. It might
their angst or whatever.
It might cause them to self-harm even more. So now the answer is so, it's so deeply ingrained in our society in terms of social media that there's no quick fix answers on this now. To certain degrees of it, there are. So we can use more data, and we can improve mental health diagnosis. We can do that. We can definitely do that. Like, that's unquestionable. Like, we can take the same data that social media companies, we can take a fraction of the data that they've got, and we can analyze that data, and we can use that data to help psychiatrists and psychologists make more accurate diagnosis. If they make more accurate diagnosis, that's going to shorten the time frame in which they're analyzing people to make a diagnosis in the first place. It's going to mean that they can get the right person, the right treatment, because also part of the reason is, or part of the problem at the moment is, the treatment that they're given is on a generalized basis, because they don't know anything about you as an individual. They don't know what cohort you belong to. So they're just saying, hey, why don't you try some yoga? Why don't you take some SSRIs? As opposed to saying, hey, I know that you belong to this specific cohort of people. And I know that within this specific cohort of people that are, white, middle class men that are into these sort of hobbies, I know that boxing really helps. I know that martial arts really helps. I know, definitely don't do yoga. That doesn't help your people whatsoever, but it's just like, we can know that from data. Like, we can actually see it. Like, you can see the change of behavior, because I can see people's behavior changing when they're clicking on an ad, or when they're in a funnel, like a buying or a consideration period. So it's like, I can see someone's behavior, like when they're suffering from anxiety or stress or depression. We'll be able to see that. At the moment, it's just the people that have access to that data, these walled gardens that are these companies, they're not fucking going to give you that data. You think Google and Apple are going to like freely start to give like charities and depression and mental health charities, or research into access to their data? No, because they're petrified that those people are going to find correlations in their data, and then people are going to close all of their accounts down, and their companies are going to go bust. So of course they're hiding it behind walled gardens, which is why we were saying earlier on that it's really easy to focus on physical health, because we've got frameworks in place for that. You can see it, physical health. If I start getting fat or whatever, it's just like, hey, I can see that. We know what's contributing to that. Whereas with mental health, it's really difficult. You can't see it. When you're just talking to someone, it's difficult to sort of spot. You can, like, in certain nuances, but you can spot it when you look at all their online behavior. Right? Once you've got all their digital data, you can see it. You can just plot it on a graph. This.
Yes.
It's just, you plot it on a graph and you can look at it and you go, that person's got depression.
So what's the so what? What are you going to do with this idea?
So it's now like, beyond an idea. It's been sort of, a few years that sort of been, working on this in terms of the research. We've formulated it into an understanding of what we'll do with, an understanding of what we'll do with it, like how we can help with it. Part of the problem of this has been that, a project like this and sort of the scale that we want to do it at, like, it requires a lot of funding to do it. Like, it's not a, hey, let's build, give us
big data.
Yeah, give us 300 grand, let's build Calm, which is essentially, let's hire Matthew McConaughey reading you bedtime stories, stick it in an app and charge you £10 a month for it. It's not this, right? We're trying to do the evaluation framework behind it, so the context of it. So you have people, oh, I need to walk my 10,000 steps a day. Why? What happens when you don't? What happens if it's 40 minutes before you go to sleep and you've only walked 7,500? Should you go outside for 40 minutes and walk 2,500 steps? How does that make a difference to your next day? No idea. It's like, we can do that. And that's what we're focused on, is the contextualization of that. So, hey, we'll look at the same data. Actually, we'll be looking at a fraction of the amount of data that, you know, Apple, Google and Facebook, you know, sort of have on you. But we'll be looking at that data and we'll be analyzing that data, but just giving it back to you. We're not selling it to anybody. We're just giving it back to you. And the sort of model that we have is that it will be free. So it's just like, we'll give it back to you. And all we'll say is like, are you aware of this is actually how you're spending your time? This is how you spend your daily commute. This is how much time you spend in the office. This is how much time you eat out. And also we've noticed these things, you know, this is what you've said about your mood on that sort of side. And hopefully we can start to get to a point where we might even be able to predict mood, you know, based on this sort of stuff. But, you know, that will come in the future. And if we can do that, then we can say to people like, hey, based on these things, it looks like these things affect your mood here. And like, here's some advice for you, you know, like maybe it's like having an angel on your shoulder, right? It's, you're just taking advice from yourself, but we're just structuring that data in a way that you'll be able to see it. And the way that we make money out of that is by going to, you know, national health services, like private, you know, medical bodies, or, you know, big corporations, and getting them to pay on your behalf, because we're saying, hey, this is reducing the amount of people that are having mental health conditions. And if it's reducing...
Or the time necessary to get them better.
Or the time to get them better, or the time to diagnose them, or they're getting accurate diagnosis in the first place.
Or reduced amount of drugs usage, because a lot of those drugs actually create new problems.
And if you think of a company perspective, you know, like how many days, like, you know, a massive company, and how many days off staff are having as the result of a mental health condition. And obviously the company doesn't want the staff to have days off, you know, because they're paying them for that. And the staff, I'm sure that they don't want to feel depressed and anxious. And that's just, you know, I'm sure they'd choose to go into work if they could, rather than like, you know, be suicidal. So it sort of works for everybody. And then it's a case of, you know, in the really binary sense, like we're going to reduce the number of, you know, sick days that the staff are taking as a result of mental health conditions. And because of that, you're going to pay us some money, you know, as a result of that. So, like, the answer is in the data, but it's, you've got this thing of people needing to come round to that idea. And I don't just mean users, you know, I don't just mean like users of saying, hey, okay, you built this, you know, I trust you, like it's all done in the right way. But I'm also talking about the mental health industry and the professionals themselves coming round to the fact of, we can show you data that will give you insights about this person's life. It's up to you to turn around and use that data in a better way, you know, and sort of work with us to turn around and say, what of this is really important? I mean, we can tell you it, you know, like from building clusters and the clever way that data science works, but we need these people also to start changing the way that they look at their approach for it.
Well, we are coming up fast on time here, so I'd like to know a little bit about, you said you were going to go to LA, and then you have some other plans after that. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, we can do, yeah.
Sure.
It's just like, I feel like I need some more whiskey, to be honest. Now we're just going to get onto my hobbies. So,
no, but I think this is actually relevant.
So yeah, after here, like my best friend lives in LA. He's a music producer sort of there. And you know, another really close friend of mine, he actually has the largest Russian language meditation app. It's called Prosta. He's there in LA as well. And then we're going to Burning Man, sort of on Sunday. So I kind of always wanted to go. And it's my birthday coming up in September. So I thought I would kind of treat myself and sort of go there and experience the whole
yeah,
vibe.
so psychedelics are obviously a huge chunk of that culture. And I know you talked about it before and offline. We talked about it a little bit. What do you think the role of psychedelics are for therapy or making people reconsider otherwise very dangerous alternatives?
So I like the fact that you said we're coming up to the end of time, and then you just went psychedelics. Let's do that.
I think the thing is, I think it is relevant. I know, man. We got the time. All right,
we could do another 3 hours.
We're gonna have to do
psychedelics.
We could do another 3 hours, but give us a teaser on what the next 3 hours are going to look like.
Well, I think with the whole psychedelic thing, again, people need to understand where that comes from. I can give like a brief sort of history lesson sort of this, but it's really important to understand it. And, why the context of everything that we spoke about before, like it might not seem like it's linked, but everything's interconnected. You talked about quantum and quantum entanglement, and like how like two particles in different space, in different places and space and stuff can still be connected, right? And I had this really, like, just for people about quantum entanglement, I had this really sort of like crappy sort of explanation of an analogy of this earlier on for people that don't know, but I kind of think on a really basic level, it's a little bit like opening up a completely random shoebox and just finding a left shoe in there, because that somewhere in the world there is the right shoe of that, which means that they are still interconnected even though they're at totally different spaces. And that's a terrible analogy of quantum entanglement.
But I like it anyway.
Yeah, okay. But it's sort of like, for no one that's heard of it, like it's sort of like roughly in the quantum mechanics realm. So first of all, you have to understand like where psychedelics come from and why there is like a class 1 or a section 1 drug. And so we could talk about just one example of this in terms of MDMA, like Dr. Shulgin, a Russian pharmacologist that sort of invented MDMA. It was specifically synthesized for PTSD, for soldiers that were coming back from the Vietnam War. And then it was made a class 1, like a section 1 drug, no therapeutic purposes whatsoever, even though almost all the trials that had been done with MDMA had said there is benefit in this, We could really go down a rabbit hole and bring up Timothy Leary and the whole sort of psychedelic movement. Timothy Leary was a big sort of proponent of psychedelics, was one of the people in sort of, the 60s and sort of 70s that sort of led that movement. He used to be a professor at Harvard, and he was one of the people that when the government tried to sort of, tried to ban this, he was taking it all the way to the Supreme Court, and was saying like, this is absolutely mental, like what you're doing here. And there's a whole sort of history of this. I'm going to do a really brief sort of like 2 minutes, trying to crush this all into 2 minutes as like a bit of a teaser and stuff of it. But there was a lady called Mary Sabina, and she, Mexican lady, she was lived in a small town that I forget the name of. I think it's called Santa Maria, but don't quote me on that. It's in Puerto Escondido. And there was a part-time pharmacologist from New York that heard about this lady and that had these mystical powers to get people closer to the answers of the universe and connecting to kind of the true meaning of life. So he went down, I think this was in around 1958 or so, but again, don't quote me exactly on the date. And he went down to Puerto Escondido and he sought out this lady, Mary Sabina, and he asked her if she could give him some of these, these magical things. And she did it in this, a ceremonial environment, and what she gave him was magic mushrooms. The active ingredient in magic mushrooms is psilocybin. Psilocybin is the drug that's being used right now. Trials all around the world, UCL, all across America and stuff. This at some point, will be hopefully legalized with purposes of depression. They've had amazing results in this. You can find it online. But this person went and tried this, and they did it in a thing that was very indigenous, very part of the Mexican sort of culture and in their tradition and culture for generations and generations before. And they did this on this kind of spiritual sort of path of kind of when they really needed to kind of connect to their next mission in life or what's their meaning of it. He had this experience, and then he came back and wrote an article about this. This article ended up getting published on the front page of Life magazine. And Life magazine was the world's biggest selling magazine at the time. So I think this is 1958. It turned out that person was the CEO of JP Morgan. And all of this, like, it almost sounds too unbelievable to for it to be real, but it's like truth is stranger than fiction. And then because of this article, then all of these people started to descend on this town, and this whole thing of the hippie and free love movement that you heard in the 1960s, this is basically the inception point of that. It actually, as the yin and yang of life goes, and like most things in this, like there's no right answer to it. It ends really sad. Loads of these Westerners sort of like descended onto this town. Mary Sabina was sort of giving them psilocybin, introducing them to it. So she thought it was a good thing to introduce this to Western culture. The village ended up like burning her house down, chasing her out the village. It was a really sad thing because they saw it as like giving the Western sort of people were basically taking something that was really meaningful as part of their culture, and then they basically just recreationally abused it. You know, they threw festivals and they started to fuck each other in fields and listen to music and stuff and talk about like, yeah, it's good vibes, man, and stuff. And like, that's not what it was about, right? It was about, you know, your true meaning of life, you're connecting to nature and this sort of side of it. Out the back of that, you then had lots of studies that were done with regards to psilocybin. You had like in terms of LSD was sort of synthesized off the back of this. You then in other indigenous communities, you had peyote, mescaline.
Leary was LSD, right?
Yeah, Leary was LSD. Huberman was LSD. So they were all. I mean, Leary was a professor at Harvard, and he just sort of got into this because he saw the results that it was having. There's trials that have been done now with regards to psilocybin. So all of this was basically happening. And what happened with the psychedelic thing is it got very much tied into the anti-war movement of the 1960s, because it was like very hippie and free love and this sort of thing. And they were all kind of against the Vietnam War, right? But they were against any type of war on it. And then the government at the time, in terms of Nixon, Reagan and stuff, they come down really hard on this because those drugs got associated with anti-war and anti-Vietnam, and they saw it as an attack on establishment. So then they were like, okay, we need to shut this down, and there was lots of kind of like, there's loads of documentaries that have been made about this and stuff, and there's loads of things. It's not just me sort of ad-libbing and stuff here. You can really like look into the research of this and why it's really important to kind of just be aware of what's out there, be aware of what is a law. So what they did was they made all of these drugs illegal, and that was really an attack on this sort of the anti-war movement of this. Still, there was underground movements. A lot of these researchers and professors and really senior scientists that are in this space, they kept those movements alive. And now it's sort of been come back in, but that was why there was a war on drugs that were declared as well. And again, when you look into the politics of this, and where you were talking about, a lot of the people that sat on the DSM-5, working at pharma companies, when you look at the war on drugs, a lot of the former presidents and stuff, there was an inordinate amount of taxpayer money in the US and in all countries goes towards military equipment. It's really difficult to justify lots of tax money going in to funding innovation within military when you don't have a war. Mm-hmm. So then they needed some sort of war. So the war on drugs, that's an ongoing war. And then obviously you can just keep funding it from there. So, I mean, again, we would need 5 or 6 hours to go down this rabbit hole. So
look, I will commit to doing this again. Okay, how about you?
Yeah, no, I'm down. Yeah,
okay,
we'll need more whiskey next time, and like maybe we actually bring some psychedelics in. That might be fun.
We'll have to see about that one, but
I have some ideas about that.
We're doing our snakes show from like an ayahuasca ceremony or something.
Oof. Richard, thank you so much for doing this. How do people get in touch with you and reach out and meet you?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have any social media, so it's really difficult to do that.
Just give your social security number.
Probably because it was my day job. So no, I guess you kind of like reach out to Robert, and if anyone has any questions or sort of wants my details, you can sort of vet them and do this on a case by case basis.
I'll just get routed right to you. All my spam going right to you. Richard, thank you so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate it, and have a good time.
Amazing.
We'll see you when you get back.
Thank you so much. No, it was nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, brother.